Okay, so I guess it's my turn to share. My first day in the industry was not at all what I expected. And looking back, I'm still kind of amazed that I stuck with it after the absolute shit show that it was. But hey, we all start somewhere, right? I was 22 and fresh out of college with a degree in communications, which sounds fancy until you realize there's not much communication going on when you can't even land an entry-level job. I was living with two roommates, both of whom had their lives figured out, or at least it seemed like it, and I was barely scraping by working as a barista. Between rent, bills, and student loans, I was one bad month away from total financial meltdown. So, naturally, I started considering alternative options. It was actually my roommate who suggested I look into dancing. She said it so casually, like she was talking about a normal office job. I laughed it off at first, but then she told me she had done it for a while during her sophomore year and made decent money without losing her soul. She was a super confident, no BS kind of girl, and I figured if she could do it, maybe I could too. She gave me the name of a club downtown that was known for being classy as strip clubs can be, I guess, and I decided to at least check it out. Worst case scenario, I get turned down and go back to making lattes for $12 an hour. I walked into the club on a Thursday afternoon, thinking it'd be quiet and low-key. Wrong. Even during the day, there were girls everywhere. Dancers, waitresses, bartenders, and they all seemed like they had it together. Meanwhile, I was a nervous wreck in my thrift store skirt and Payless heels. I felt like I had newbie written all over me. The manager, a guy named Tony, because of course his name was Tony, called me into his office. He was a tall dude with a shaved head and sunglasses, indoors, and he looked like he'd seen it all. He gave me the usual rundown about how the club works, the house fees, what to expect from customers, and the rules, most of which were just common sense. He told me I could start that night if I wanted to. I hesitated, thinking I should take some time to mentally prepare, but Tony wasn't really the wait and think it over type. He just said, "You either do it or you don't. No point in dragging it out." So, there I was, signed up for my first shift, and suddenly it all felt very real. That evening, I went home, did my makeup like I was about to walk a red carpet, or at least tried to, and then threw on the one sexy outfit I owned, a tight black dress I'd bought on sale. I didn't have stripper shoes, so I wore these cheap platform sandals that looked like they'd barely survive a night of dancing. Spoiler alert, they didn't. I showed up early, hoping I'd have time to calm my nerves, but as soon as I walked in, I realized there was no warming up to this. The music was already blasting, lights flashing, and there were guys everywhere. I felt like I'd been thrown into the deep end of the pool without knowing how to swim. One of the other dancers, a girl named Crystal, saw me looking lost and took pity on me. She pulled me into the dressing room and gave me a quick, no-nonsense crash course on how to survive the night. "Don't let the customers get too touchy," she said, "and always ask for the money before the dance. No freebies." She also gave me one of her old pairs of heels to wear, which were about 2 sizes too big, but a hell of a lot better than the sandals I brought. My first stage set? Absolute disaster. I wish I had some glamorous story about how I strutted out there and on the stage, but nope. The music started, I grabbed onto the pole like it was going to save me, and just kind of swayed awkwardly. I tried to look sexy, but I'm pretty sure I just looked terrified. A couple of drunk guys in the front row started shouting, "Take it off." And I remember thinking, is this really happening? Am I seriously doing this right now? It felt like the longest 3 minutes of my life. And when it was over, I practically ran off the stage. I didn't even wait to see if anyone had thrown any money. I was shaking, my face was burning, and all I wanted to do was hide in the dressing room and never come out. But Crystal found me again and said, "You're fine. First time's always rough. It gets easier." I wasn't so sure about that, but I nodded like I believed her. The rest of the night was better, I guess. I didn't go back on stage, but I did a couple of lap dances. The first one was with a guy who barely spoke a word the entire time. He just stared at me like I was some kind of puzzle he couldn't figure out. It was awkward, but at least he paid up front and didn't try anything sketchy. The second lap dance, though? Yeah, that one was a nightmare. The guy reeked of booze, and within 30 seconds, he was trying to put his hands everywhere. I kept moving them away, and he kept bringing them back. Finally, I'd had enough. I told him the dance was over, stood up, and walked away. He started complaining, saying he didn't get what he paid for, but Tony saw the whole thing and kicked him out. I was so shaken, I almost quit right there. I mean, no one prepares you for that level of grossness. But then, something happened at the end of the night that changed things for me. One of the regulars, an older guy in his 50s, super respectful, came up to me and handed me a $100 bill. He said, "You did good tonight, kid. You'll figure it out." I didn't even know what to say. I thanked him, of course, but it wasn't just the money that hit me. It was like for the first time all night, I felt like I could do this. That maybe I wasn't completely out of my depth. Maybe, just maybe, I'd survive. I ended up going back the next night. And the night after that. Slowly, I started to get more comfortable. I figured out how to work the stage without looking like I was holding onto the pole for dear life. I got better at reading customers, knowing who was there to have a good time and who was just there to be creepy. I even started making decent money. More than I'd ever made slinging coffee, that's for sure. The thing is, it's not just about dancing. It's about confidence, about owning the room even when you feel like you're falling apart inside. I didn't know that on my first day, but I learned it fast. You have to put on a persona, leave your insecurities at the door, and just play the part. Once I figured that out, everything got easier. I stayed at that club for about a year. By the time I left, I had saved enough to pay off a chunk of my student loans, and even started taking some night classes to get my career on track. Stripping wasn't my dream job, obviously, but it got me through a tough time, and for that, I'm grateful. So yeah, my first day was a disaster, but it didn't break me. If anything, it made me stronger. It's a weird, crazy job, but it taught me more about myself than I ever expected. For the last 6 years, I've been pretending I still believe in God. It's not like I set out to lie about it. It just sort of happened. I grew up in a super religious family. Church every Sunday, Bible studies, youth groups, the whole thing. My parents are the kind of people who pray before every meal, who keep framed Bible verses on the walls of our house, who talk about their faith like it's the foundation of everything in their lives. And it was like that for me too for a long time. I believed. I prayed. I did everything I was supposed to do. But when I went to college, things started to shift. For the first time, I was out of that bubble, and I met people who thought differently, who asked questions I'd never considered before. It was subtle at first, small doubts that crept in during late-night conversations in dorm rooms or philosophy classes. But those doubts grew. I couldn't ignore them. I tried, though. For a while, I doubled down on my faith, thinking maybe I wasn't praying hard enough or wasn't dedicated enough. I went to church, read devotionals, even went on a couple of mission trips. But none of it made the doubts go away. If anything, the more I tried to convince myself, the more hollow it all felt. By the time I graduated, I realized I didn't believe in any of it anymore. Not the Bible, not heaven or hell, not God. But how do you admit something like that when your whole family revolves around their faith? I didn't know how to tell them, especially my mom. My mom is one of those people who talks about God's plan like it's as real and obvious as gravity. She prays for me, for our family, for strangers she sees on the street. Her whole life is built on her faith, and I couldn't bear the thought of telling her I didn't share it anymore. I knew it would break her heart. So, I didn't say anything. I kept pretending. I still go to church with them every Sunday. I sit there, smile, nod along, and even sing the hymns. I bow my head when they pray, mumble amen at the right moments, and fake it all. But in my head, I'm somewhere else entirely. Sometimes I'm thinking about what I need to do later that day, or replaying conversations from the week. Anything to distract myself from the guilt of knowing I'm lying. The sermons don't resonate with me anymore. They feel like stories, comforting maybe, but just stories. It's worse during the holidays. Christmas, Easter, those times when faith is front and center in everything we do as a family. My mom always asked me to help with the church events, setting up for Christmas Eve service or joining in the Easter potluck. And I do it, all of it, because I know how much it means to her. But inside, I feel like a fraud. I watch my parents and siblings get emotional during the services, tears in their eyes as they sing about Jesus rising from the dead. And I can't feel any of it. I'm just there going through the motions. I've even lied during family prayers. That's the part that eats at me the most. My parents have this tradition where, at every big family dinner, we all go around the table and say something we're thankful for, followed by a prayer. I used to love it. But now, when it's my turn, I make something up about being grateful for God's blessings, or His guidance, or whatever vague religious phrase I can think of, just to keep the charade going. My dad always smiles so proudly, like he's happy that I've grown into my faith, and I feel like the worst person in the world. The lie has even bled into my social life. A lot of my old friends from church still think I'm a believer. They'll send me Bible verses or ask me to pray for them, and I always respond like I'm still part of that world. I've been invited to so many church events, prayer groups, and Bible studies, and I've gone to a few just to keep up appearances. It's easier to lie than to explain why I've drifted away. I don't want to deal with the awkward conversations, the judgment, or the disappointment. But the worst part is that I've lied to my husband about it. He's not super religious, but he grew up Catholic and still considers himself a believer. We got married in a church, we said vows before God, and we even had a priest bless our home. And the whole time, I just went along with it. He doesn't know that I don't pray at night, that I don't believe in an afterlife, that when he talks about God, I just smile and nod, the same way I do with my family. He's talked about wanting to raise our future kids with faith, and I've gone along with it, because how am I supposed to tell him now? How do you say, hey, by the way, I've been pretending to believe in God this whole time? I know it sounds crazy. Just come clean, right? But it's not that easy. My whole life is built around this lie now. Telling the truth would unravel everything. My parents would be devastated. They'd never look at me the same. My mom would probably cry for days, thinking she failed me somehow. My friends would feel betrayed. And my husband? I don't even know what he'd do. He'd probably be shocked at first, but I'm terrified it would change how he sees me. We're supposed to be building a life together, and this would feel like a betrayal. I've lied to him every day of our marriage, and that's something you can't take back. I think about the future a lot. What's going to happen when we have kids? Am I really going to teach them about a God I don't believe in? Am I going to keep pretending for the rest of my life? I hate the idea of lying to my own children, but I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to come clean. So, for now, I keep pretending. I go to church, I say the prayers, I play the part, and every time, I wonder how long I can keep it up before the truth finally comes out. All right, here goes one more story. This one is something I've never really talked about, not even with my closest friends. It's not that I'm embarrassed by it or anything. It's just hard to explain, even to myself. But sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, it creeps back into my mind and refuses to leave. I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night wasn't just some bad dream or a trick of the light. It was about 6 years ago, during my first year at university. I was one of those kids who thought they'd be fine living alone in a city hours away from home, until it actually happened. That first semester was tough. New people, new environment, all the pressures that come with it. So when midterms hit, I needed a break. My roommate, Jake, mentioned that his uncle had a cabin a couple of hours away from campus, up in the woods, and that we should all go there for the weekend. He said it'd be a good way to blow off steam and recharge before finals. I wasn't one to pass up a chance to get out of the city, so I agreed. It was supposed to be a fun, low-key trip. Jake, myself, and 2 of our other friends, Sam and Ethan, loaded up Jake's beat-up Jeep and headed out late Friday afternoon. The cabin was pretty remote. We'd picked up groceries and supplies in the nearest town, about 20 minutes away, and by the time we got to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. The place was small but cozy. An old wooden structure nestled between towering pine trees with a small clearing in front and a river not too far off. No electricity, just a fireplace, some lanterns, and a generator for emergencies. It felt like the perfect escape from campus life. We unpacked, settled in, and built a fire outside to cook dinner and hang out. The first night was great. We drank a little, roasted some marshmallows, and swapped stories around the fire. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright it felt like we were sitting under a giant blanket of them. After a few hours, we all turned in for the night, exhausted but in a good way. The second night, though, that's when things got weird. We spent most of Saturday hiking and fishing by the river. It was a perfect day, clear skies, cool breeze, nothing unusual at all. We got back to the cabin just before dusk, made dinner, and were planning to have another campfire. But the wind started to pick up as the sun went down, and by the time we finished eating, it was too windy to keep a fire going. So, we decided to hang out inside the cabin instead. There was this old battery-powered radio in the cabin, and Jake found some static fill station playing classic rock. so we let that play in the background while we sat around talking. I remember we were in the middle of some dumb debate about horror movies, something about what the scariest monster was, when the radio suddenly cut out. No warning, just this loud static and then silence. It startled all of us, but Jake laughed it off, said the thing was probably just old and busted, and turned it off. That's when we heard it. A faint tapping sound like someone or something was lightly knocking on the window. We all froze. The wind was still howling outside, making the trees sway and creak, but this was different. It was rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little to peek outside. After a second, he turned back to us, looking confused. "There's nothing out there," he said, "just the trees." We tried to laugh it off, joking that maybe it was a raccoon or something. But the tapping continued, moving from the window by the door to the one on the far side of the room. Each time, it was the same 3 light taps, like someone was testing the glass. By this point, the vibe in the cabin had shifted. None of us were laughing anymore. Jake suggested that maybe it was the wind blowing something against the cabin like a branch or debris, but when we looked outside again, there wasn't anything close enough to the windows that could be causing it. The tapping stopped, and for a few minutes, everything was quiet again. We tried to shake off the weirdness and go back to our conversation, but the mood was off. Everyone was on edge, glancing at the windows like we were expecting something to appear. Then, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just 3 soft, deliberate knocks. We all looked at each other, our faces pale. No one was supposed to be out there. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the closest town was a 20-minute drive. There were no neighbors, no other cabins nearby. We hadn't seen a single person since we arrived. "Did you invite someone?" Sam asked, his voice low and shaky. Jake shook his head, looking as freaked out as the rest of us. "No, no one else even knows we're here." For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stared at the door, waiting for, I don't know what. The knock came again, a little louder this time. 3 steady knocks, like whoever or whatever was out there was getting impatient. Jake stood up, clearly freaked, but tried to play it cool. "I'll check," he said, his voice wavering just enough for us to notice. He grabbed the flashlight from the counter, flicked it on, and walked over to the door. He hesitated for a second, then slowly cracked it open, shining the light outside. Nothing. There was no one there. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone or anything had been standing on the porch. Jake shut the door quickly, locking it behind him, and turned back to us. "There's nobody out there." We didn't know what to do. The rational part of my brain wanted to believe it was just some prank or that maybe we'd been hearing things. But the tension in the air was so thick, none of us could relax. We ended up staying up for hours, not really talking much, just listening to the wind outside and waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. The tapping never came back, and no more knocks on the door. Eventually, one by one, we all fell asleep, though it was more like passing out from exhaustion than actually sleeping. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin earlier than we'd planned. No one really wanted to admit it, but we were all on edge. Something about that night had spooked us, and none of us felt comfortable staying any longer. Here's the part that really gets me, though. A couple of days after we got back, Jake called me. He sounded weird on the phone, like he didn't want to say what he was about to tell me. "Hey man, I talked to my uncle about the cabin," he said. "I asked him if anything weird ever happened up there, and he said yeah." Apparently, his uncle hadn't used the cabin in years because something always felt off whenever he went up there. He said he and his wife had heard strange noises outside at night too. Footsteps, tapping on the windows, even voices. But when they'd look, no one was ever there. They figured it was just the isolation getting to them. But eventually they stopped going because it happened every time. I haven't been back to that cabin since. None of us have. I don't know what we heard that night, or why it stopped, but I can still hear those knocks, soft but deliberate, echoing in my head whenever I think about it. And whatever it was, it knew we were there. I still remember the day it all started to unravel, even though at the time, I didn't realize what I was seeing. Funny how hindsight sharpens everything. We'd been together for 6 years, and things were steady, comfortable. We'd even talked about marriage in that half-serious, someday way that long-term couples do. I trusted him completely, so much so that I never saw what was coming until it was too late. It started small, as these things usually do. He'd always been a creature of habit. His routine was predictable, and so was our relationship. Weeknights were spent at home, weekends were for hiking or binge-watching some show on Netflix. We were the kind of couple that had our own inside jokes, finishing each other's sentences, all that. But one day, things started to shift. The first clue was his sudden obsession with his phone. We used to share everything. He'd show me memes or ask me to help him respond to texts while he was driving. But then I noticed he started keeping his phone closer, more private. It became this almost invisible barrier between us. I didn't even realize it at first. Just small things, like how he'd take it with him everywhere. I'm talking everywhere, even the bathroom. It was weird because we had never been secretive about that stuff before. One evening, his phone buzzed while we were watching a movie. Out of pure reflex, I glanced at it just to see if it was something important. Before I could even process what I saw, he snatched it up and mumbled something about work. Now, I'm not the type to immediately assume the worst, so I laughed it off, thinking maybe he was planning a surprise for me or something. But still, that little moment stuck with me. A couple of weeks went by, and he became more distant. He'd started going out with his friends more often, guys I had never met. I didn't think much of it because I trusted him. We didn't have that kind of relationship where we checked in on each other constantly. But suddenly, he was going out at least once a week, coming back late, always smelling like alcohol and something else. It wasn't his usual cologne, and it wasn't the smell of cigarettes or anything like that. It was perfume. But I convinced myself it was just from being at a bar. I didn't want to seem insecure, so I let it go. The excuses started to pile up, though. Work's been crazy. The guys just needed a night out. It's no big deal. I wanted to believe him, and for a while I did. But deep down, that gnawing feeling in my stomach was getting harder to ignore. Then came the accusations, and that's when things really started to spiral. Out of nowhere, he began accusing me of being distant, of not caring enough about our relationship. He'd say things like, "You're always on your phone," or "Who are you texting all the time?" It was so bizarre because I hadn't changed a thing about my behavior, but suddenly he was acting like I was the one pulling away. At first, I was confused, thinking maybe he was stressed about work or something. But the more I tried to reassure him, the more defensive he got. It got worse when he started accusing me of cheating. That completely blindsided me. I had never given him any reason to think that, not even close. One night, out of the blue, he snapped at me saying, "Are you seeing someone else? You're always so distracted lately." I was stunned. I asked him where the hell that was coming from, but he just shrugged and said he'd noticed changes in me. That's when I knew something was wrong, but I still couldn't bring myself to believe he was the one doing anything behind my back. It was classic projection, though I didn't realize it at the time. One Friday night, he said he was going out for drinks with some work friends. He was in a rush, pulling on his nicest shirt, slicking back his hair like he was headed to a fancy dinner instead of a pub. I remember teasing him. "You're really going all out for this guy's night, huh?" He gave me this tight-lipped smile and said, "It's just how I dress now." Something about the way he said it made my stomach churn, but again, I let it slide. I couldn't shake that weird feeling all night. He'd been distant for weeks, and I was starting to feel like I didn't even know him anymore. So, I did something I'd never done before in our entire relationship. I checked his location on my phone. We'd shared our locations for safety reasons ages ago, and I hadn't thought much about it since. But when I checked, he wasn't at any bar or pub. He was in some residential neighborhood on the other side of town. I sat there for a minute, staring at the map, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe they were at someone's house for drinks? Maybe he'd crashed at a friend's place? But deep down, I knew none of that made sense. I texted him, asked how his night was going. No response. A few hours later, he finally replied with, "Good. Just heading home now." The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The location, the sudden change in behavior, the defensiveness, it all started clicking together like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I snooped. While he was in the shower, I picked up his phone. My hands were shaking as I opened his messages, and that's when I saw it. Text between him and another woman. They weren't just friendly texts either. They were explicit, with plans to meet up, photos, everything. My heart dropped. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. He'd been seeing her for months. Months. All the while, He'd been coming home to me, looking me in the eyes, telling me he loved me. When he came out of the shower, I was sitting there with his phone in my hand. I didn't say anything, just held it up and showed him the messages. The look on his face said it all. He knew he was caught. He tried to stammer out an apology, but I couldn't even listen. I told him to pack his things and leave. There was no screaming, no dramatic fight, just the cold, crushing realization that the man I loved had betrayed me in the worst possible way. He left that night. I didn't want to hear his excuses or his apologies. I didn't want to hear about how he was confused or how it just happened. I didn't care. The damage was done. It took me a long time to process everything. For weeks, I replayed every conversation, every guy's night, every little moment when I should have seen the truth. I felt like an idiot for not catching on sooner. But the thing is, when you trust someone, you don't want to see it. You make excuses. You tell yourself they'd never hurt you like that because the alternative is too painful to accept. Looking back, the signs were there. The phone secrecy, the late nights, the sudden accusations. It's crazy how obvious it seems now, but when you're in it, you're blind. You want to believe the best in the person you love, even when the truth is staring you right in the face. If I learned anything from that experience, it's that trust is fragile. Once it's broken, there's no going back. And your gut, it's rarely wrong. If something feels off, if you're constantly second-guessing yourself, there's a reason for it. I ignored my gut for way too long, and it cost me. I'm in a better place now, but I still think about it sometimes. How easily I was fooled, how much I wanted to believe him even when everything inside me was screaming that something wasn't right. If I ever find myself in a situation like that again, I won't ignore the signs. Because once you do, the fallout is so much worse. This one still talked about at every reunion, and I don't think anyone will ever forget it. It was my junior year, and we had this big end-of-year pep rally. You know the deal. Cheerleaders doing routines, the marching band playing the school fight song, teachers pretending they're excited about the football team even though they hadn't won a game all season. The usual stuff. But there was one part of the pep rally everyone was actually excited for: the annual teacher versus student dodgeball match. This was a tradition at our school where a group of seniors would face off against a team of teachers in dodgeball. And every year, the students always won. It wasn't even close most of the time. I mean, our teachers weren't exactly athletes. There was Mr. McAllister, who taught social studies and could barely walk up a flight of stairs without getting winded, and Mrs. Klein, our librarian, who was in her 60s and probably hadn't thrown anything in decades. But this year was different. This year, we had Coach Martinez. Coach Martinez was new to our school that year. And let me tell you, the guy was a unit. He was fresh out of college, had played college football, and looked like he could bench press a car. When we heard he was going to be on the teachers' dodgeball team, everyone thought maybe, just maybe, the teachers had a chance this time. But no one was really expecting anything too crazy. After all, it was just dodgeball. Or so we thought. The day of the pep rally came, and the whole school packed into the gym. It was loud, people were waving signs, the cheerleaders were doing their thing, and everyone was buzzing about the dodgeball game. The students' team had some of the top athletes from the senior class, and they were talking big, strutting around like they were going to wipe the floor with the teachers. One of the seniors, Greg, even made a point to walk over to the teacher's side and shout, "Better start stretching, old folks. We're coming for you." Typical Greg, always running his mouth. Then the game started. At first, it was what you'd expect. The students were dominating. They were younger, faster, and clearly better at dodgeball. Mr. McAllister got out in the first 10 seconds after a ball barely tapped him on the leg, and Mrs. Klein didn't even bother throwing the ball. She just kind of shuffled around in the back, hoping no one would notice her. But then, Coach Martinez got serious. He had been hanging back, watching the chaos, barely moving. But as soon as the students knocked out most of the other teachers, it was like he flipped a switch. I remember the exact moment it happened. One of the seniors, Greg, tried to throw a ball at Coach Martinez, and it was a pretty decent throw too. But Coach caught it like it was nothing, with one hand while smirking. The whole gym gasped. Then he started his rampage. The guy was like a human cannon. He launched dodgeballs at the seniors with so much force, it was like watching them get hit by freight trains. One by one, the students dropped like flies. Bam, ball to the chest, Greg went down. Bam, another ball to the leg. Sarah, one of the soccer stars, was out. The crowd went nuts. It was the first time anyone had seen the teachers actually start winning. But here's where things got really crazy. Coach Martinez had the last ball, and the only senior left was Jason, the quarterback of the football team and, of course, the most arrogant guy in school. It was down to the two of them, student versus teacher, and the tension was insane. People were standing on the bleachers, screaming, waiting to see what would happen. Jason grabbed a ball and hurled it at Coach with everything he had. But again, Coach caught it like it was nothing. You could see Jason's confidence crack a little. Then, Coach Martinez wound up for the throw. And man, when I say he wound up, I mean he pulled his arm back like he was about to launch a missile. The entire gym went silent as he whipped the ball toward Jason. But Jason wasn't going down without a fight. At the last second, Jason dodged, like really dodged. He ducked so low that the ball flew right over his head. But here's the thing, it didn't just fly over his head. It flew straight into the stands, and not just anywhere in the stands. It hit the school mascot square in the face. Our mascot was this guy named Kyle who dressed up as a giant eagle, complete with a huge foam head. The ball hit him so hard that his eagle head spun around backward, and he fell off the bleachers onto the gym floor. I swear, the entire gym lost it. People were laughing, screaming, pointing at Kyle who was lying on the floor, flailing his arms because he couldn't see with the mascot head twisted around like that. The cheerleaders were freaking out. The teachers were covering their mouths, trying not to laugh. And Coach Martinez just stood there, stunned, like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Meanwhile, poor Kyle was still trying to get up, but the foam eagle costume was so bulky he could barely move. A couple of the teachers had to rush over to help him up and untwist the mascot head. I don't know if he was crying or just embarrassed, but when they finally got the eagle head off, his face was bright red, and he just bolted out of the gym, leaving the costume behind. And that's when Jason made his move. While everyone was still distracted by the whole mascot fiasco, Jason grabbed the dodgeball off the floor and, without warning, chucked it straight at Coach Martinez. And what do you know? It hit him, square in the back. Jason had won. The gym went ballistic. The seniors were jumping up and down like they'd just won the Super Bowl. And even though Jason kind of cheated by throwing the ball while Coach wasn't looking, no one cared. The students had won the game, the teachers were left speechless, and Kyle the mascot had become an instant legend. The rest of the pep rally was a blur. Everyone was buzzing about what had just happened, and by the time we got to class later that day, the story had already gotten out of control. People were saying Coach Martinez knocked Kyle unconscious, that Jason had thrown the winning ball from 50 feet away, which definitely didn't happen. And someone even started a rumor that the school was going to retire the eagle costume because of emotional trauma. By the end of the week, Kyle was back in the mascot suit, but no one ever let him forget the time he got knocked out by a dodgeball in front of the entire school. As for Coach Martinez, he took the whole thing in stride, but I think after that day, he realized maybe he needed to dial it down a notch. Dude was built for war, not high school dodgeball. And Jason? Well, he's still insufferable, bragging to anyone who'll listen about how he's the only guy who took down Coach Martinez. Whatever, man. We all know it was the mascot fiasco that won the day. So yeah, that's the story of how a dodgeball game turned into a full-on spectacle that no one expected. Classic high school, right? Looking back, I should have known. All the signs were there, blinking in bright neon lights. But when you love someone, it's amazing how easy it is to ignore what's right in front of you. I'd been with my ex for almost 5 years, and if you'd asked me back then, I would have sworn up and down that he was the guy I'd marry. We were solid, or so I thought. Little did I know, I was living in some kind of twisted, blissful ignorance while everything crumbled around me. The first red flag was his sudden obsession with his appearance. Now, don't get me wrong, I was all for self-care and looking good, but this was different. He went from throwing on jeans and a t-shirt to buying fancy clothes, hitting the gym almost every day, and even switching colognes. He'd always been pretty laid back, but out of nowhere, he was dressing like he had a date with GQ. At first, I thought it was just a phase, like maybe he was feeling a little insecure and wanted to freshen things up. I even complimented him on it. Wow, looking good, babe. Who are you trying to impress? I joked, and here's where it started getting weird. Instead of laughing it off or rolling his eyes, he just sort of smirked and said, "You, of course." But there was something off in his tone, something that made my stomach twist. Still, I brushed it aside, convincing myself that I was reading too much into things. Then came the phone. Isn't it always the phone? We used to be super chill about our phones, leaving them lying around, swapping them if one of us needed to make a quick call or check directions. But suddenly, his phone became like a vault. It was glued to his hand at all times. He'd take it to the bathroom, hide the screen if I walked by, and of course it was always on silent. He'd started flipping it face down whenever we were together, and if it buzzed, he'd casually glance at it and say, "Just work stuff." I didn't want to be that girlfriend. You know, the one who snoops or gets jealous over every little thing. But I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I even asked him about it once, jokingly. "What's with the phone secrecy? Are you texting the FBI?" He laughed, but it was forced, like he was trying too hard to make it seem like it was no big deal. You know how it is, work's been crazy. I'm just trying to keep things under control. It was the start of a pattern, excuses that seemed harmless on the surface, but in hindsight, they were cracks in the foundation. Then the late nights started. He worked in marketing, and yeah, sometimes his job required long hours, but suddenly he was staying late all the time. "I've got a big project," he'd say, or "the team's meeting up for drinks after work." I believed him because why wouldn't I? He'd always been hardworking, and I didn't want to come off as paranoid. But it wasn't just the late nights. He stopped inviting me to work events too. I used to go to happy hours with his coworkers, and we'd always attend his company's holiday parties together. But one day, he just stopped including me. "It's boring," he said. "You wouldn't enjoy it." That stung a little, but I didn't push back. I told myself that I was overthinking again, that he probably just needed some space. The distance between us grew so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. He used to be affectionate, always pulling me in for a kiss when he got home, holding my hand when we were out, cuddling up on the couch during movie nights. But then little by little, all of that stopped. It was like there was an invisible wall between us. He was still there, physically, but emotionally, it felt like he was already gone. I remember one night, he came home late from another work event. I was sitting on the couch, waiting for him, and when he walked in, he barely glanced at me. He went straight to the shower without saying a word. That's when I noticed the scent. It wasn't his usual cologne. It was something floral, like perfume. My heart sank, but I still didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone hugged him goodbye, I thought. I didn't say anything that night. I just sat there, letting the doubt fester inside me. A few days later, the accusation started, but not from me. From him, out of nowhere. He began accusing me of being distant, of not paying enough attention to our relationship. He'd say things like, "You don't care about me anymore," or "You're always on your phone. Are you talking to someone else?" It was so bizarre, especially because he was the one acting different. I felt like I was losing my mind. I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe I had been neglecting him in some way. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The final straw came when I found a receipt in his coat pocket. It was for a fancy restaurant across town, one we'd never been to. I hadn't thought much of it until I saw the date. It was from a night he'd told me he was working late. My hands were shaking when I confronted him about it. At first, he tried to laugh it off, saying it was a work dinner. But when I really pressed him, he finally admitted it. There was someone else. I felt like my whole world collapsed in that moment. The person I'd built a life with, the person I trusted more than anyone, had been lying to me for months. And the worst part? I wasn't even shocked. Deep down, I think I'd known for a while. The late nights, the secretive phone habits, the emotional distance, it all made sense now. He tried to explain, said it wasn't serious, that it was just a fling. He claimed he still loved me, that he didn't want to lose me, that he didn't know why he'd done it. But the damage was done. I couldn't look at him without feeling sick. I couldn't believe I'd been so blind, that I'd let myself believe his lies for so long. We broke up that night. There was no screaming, no dramatic fight, just silence. I packed a bag and left. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart, not my own. In the weeks that followed, I kept replaying everything in my head, going over every red flag, every moment when I should have known. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. But at the same time, I realized how easy it is to convince yourself that everything is fine when you don't want to face the truth. It took me a long time to rebuild my trust in people after that. I kept thinking about all the little signs I had ignored, the sudden gym obsession, the late nights, the defensiveness. Looking back, they were all so obvious. But when you're in love, you don't want to believe that the person you care about could betray you like that. If I've learned anything, it's that you have to trust your instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. People don't just change overnight for no reason. And if they start hiding things from you, there's a reason for it. I spent too long doubting myself, convincing myself that I was being paranoid, when the truth was right in front of me the whole time. I won't make that mistake again. This happened when I was about 17, during the summer before my senior year of high school. I was living with my mom and younger brother in a pretty quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't rural, but it wasn't the kind of place where people were always around either. Lots of woods and open space between the houses. The kind of place where you might go days without seeing your neighbors. That summer, my mom had started working late shifts at the hospital, so it was usually just me and my little brother Max home by ourselves in the evenings. He was only 10 at the time, so I was responsible for making sure he did his homework, ate dinner, and went to bed on time. Normally, this wasn't a big deal. Max was an easy kid to take care of, and I didn't mind having the house to ourselves. But one night, things got weird. It started out like any other night. Max and I had pizza for dinner, watched a movie, and then I told him to head to bed around 9 p.m. After he went upstairs, I was just hanging out in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I got this strange feeling. It was subtle at first, like a low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. I figured it was nothing. It was probably just the quiet making me feel on edge. The house always felt kind of eerie at night when it was just the two of us, especially with the woods right behind us. But then I started hearing noises. At first, it was just a soft, rustling sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. I assumed it was the wind or maybe a stray animal, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard it again, this time louder. It sounded like something or someone was moving around just outside the living room window. I stood up and glanced toward the window, but I couldn't see anything. The curtains were drawn, and it was too dark outside to make anything out. Still, that uneasy feeling in my stomach was growing, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there. I walked over to the window, trying to be as quiet as possible, and pulled the curtain back just a little. My heart jumped into my throat when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard, near the tree line. It was dark, and they were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could clearly see someone standing there just watching the house. I froze. My first thought was that it was one of the neighbors, but why would anyone be out there this late just standing around? I let the curtain fall back into place and stood there, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to freak Max out, but I also didn't want to ignore the situation. Something was definitely not right. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom, asking when she'd be home, but I knew she wouldn't get back until her break, which wasn't for another hour or so. That's when I decided I should check the front door, just to make sure it was locked. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that it was probably nothing. But when I walked toward the front hallway, I heard its footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the porch steps. My heart started racing, and I quietly tiptoed to the door, looking through the peephole. There was nobody there. The porch was empty, but the sound of footsteps had been unmistakable, like someone had walked right up to the door and then stopped. I held my breath, trying to listen, but everything was silent again. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I locked the door, double-checking that the deadbolt was in place, and backed away slowly, my mind racing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I went back to the living room, trying to keep myself calm. I was about to sit down when I heard a new sound, a faint tapping on one of the windows. This time, it wasn't coming from the front of the house. It was coming from the side, where the kitchen was. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. Slowly, I crept toward the kitchen, staying low, trying not to make any noise. As I got closer, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. When I finally reached the kitchen, I crouched beneath the counter and peeked around the corner, just enough to see the window. There was a man standing right outside, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging up the window as he stared into the house. I ducked back out of sight. my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't anyone from the neighborhood, and the look on his face, it wasn't right. He wasn't just looking into the house. He was waiting for something. I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Max was upstairs, probably fast asleep, and I didn't want to make any noise that might wake him. I grabbed my phone again and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside our house. I gave them the address, and they told me to stay on the line and remain quiet until help arrived. But while I was on the phone, the tapping on the window stopped. Silence. I peeked around the corner again, and the man was gone. My pulse was racing, and my mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Where did he go? Was he still outside? Was he coming back? I heard the faintest sound from the back of the house, like the creak of the back gate being pushed open. I felt my stomach drop. That gate led directly to the backyard, to the door that opened into the kitchen. I grabbed the kitchen knife, not even sure what I was planning to do with it, and backed up into the living room. My eyes were glued to the back door, waiting for it to rattle, for the handle to move. But nothing happened, just silence. It felt like hours before I finally heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. When the officers arrived, they checked the yard, the side of the house, and the area around the windows, but they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no signs that someone had been there, except for a single muddy handprint on the glass of the kitchen window. They told me it was probably just a drifter or someone passing through, maybe looking for an easy target. But the way that man had stood there, watching, waiting, it felt too deliberate, too creepy. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every noise, every creak, every gust of wind had me on edge. Even after my mom got home and the police had left, I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. For weeks after that, I couldn't look out the windows at night without feeling that same chill. I started double-checking the locks, pulling the curtains shut, and leaving all the lights on when I was home alone. I never saw that man again, but that night stuck with me. It was one of those moments where your instincts kick in and you just know something is wrong. I'm glad I trusted my gut that night, because who knows what would have happened if I hadn't. So, this is the story of how I almost died because of popcorn. Yep, you heard me right. That buttery, salty snack you probably have at the movies almost sent me straight to the afterlife. It all started on a random Friday night. I was home alone, binge-watching some show I can't even remember now, and I had this craving for popcorn. I'm not talking about the microwave stuff. I'm talking about the real deal. I'd recently gotten into making popcorn on the stovetop because, it's supposed to be healthier or whatever. I had my little pot, some kernels, and a generous amount of oil. I figured it'd be a quick snack to enjoy with my show. Easy, right? Now, I've made stovetop popcorn plenty of times before, so I wasn't exactly new to this. I put the pot on the burner, threw in the oil, dropped in the kernels, and covered the pot with the lid. Then I waited for the magic to happen. I could hear the popping start up after a minute or two, and the smell was incredible. But as the kernels kept popping, I realized something was off. The lid started rattling like crazy, and it seemed like there was way more steam than usual. I figured, okay, no big deal, it's just really popping today. So I reached out to lift the lid just a little bit to let the steam out. That's when disaster struck. The moment I lifted the lid, a burst of flaming oil shot up out of the pot. I'm talking about a literal fireball of burning oil flying into the air like some kind of demented popcorn volcano. I panicked and dropped the lid, which only made things worse. The flames spread instantly, and before I knew it, my stovetop was on fire. Like actually on fire. My first instinct, for some reason, was to throw water on it. Now, anyone who's ever dealt with a grease fire will tell you that's the worst thing you can do, but in the heat of the moment, pun intended, that's exactly what I did. I grabbed the nearest glass of water and threw it at the stove. Of course, this didn't put the fire out. It made the flames flare up even more, and now I had burning oil splattering all over the kitchen counters, the floor, and me. I jumped back just in time to avoid getting a face full of flaming oil, but I could feel the heat on my skin, and my heart was pounding out of my chest. At this point, I was convinced the entire kitchen was about to go up in flames, and I had no idea what to do. The fire was spreading fast, and I could barely think straight. Then, somehow, Through the panic, I remembered hearing somewhere that you're supposed to smother grease fires. I grabbed the nearest towel, threw it over the burning pot, and prayed to every deity I could think of that it would work. It didn't. The flames were still coming up around the sides of the towel, and the smoke was getting thicker. My kitchen was starting to look like a scene from an action movie, and I was running out of options. I knew I couldn't just leave the fire to burn. It was already starting to creep up the walls, but I also didn't have a fire extinguisher because apparently I like living dangerously. So, I did the only thing left to do. I called 911. Let me tell you, explaining to the operator that you've set your kitchen on fire while trying to make popcorn is about as humiliating as it gets. But she stayed calm and told me to get out of the house immediately. She also gave me a quick lecture about not using water on grease fires, which, to be fair, I probably deserved. I grabbed my phone, ran out the front door, and waited for the fire department to arrive, all while watching black smoke billow out of my kitchen window. When the firefighters showed up, they moved fast. Within minutes, they had the fire under control. One of them came over to check on me, and I was just standing there in shock, covered in a mix of sweat and the smell of burnt oil. He gave me a look like, seriously? Popcorn? But was nice enough not to say it out loud. They made sure everything was safe, and after they left, I walked back into my house to assess the damage. The kitchen was a disaster. The pot was a charred wreck. The counters were covered in black soot. And my walls? Yeah, they were scorched. I had burn marks on the floor, the ceiling, everywhere. It was like a popcorn bomb had gone off in there. And the worst part? I never even got to eat the damn popcorn. I sat there for a while, just staring at the mess, still in shock over how quickly things had spiraled out of control. One second, I was about to have a chill night with a snack, and the next, I was almost burning my house down. It was insane. After cleaning up as much as I could, I did some research on grease fires because apparently I missed that lesson in life. Turns out, there's a reason they tell you not to use water. It causes the oil to splash and spreads the fire. I should have used baking soda or a fire extinguisher, if I'd had one. I also learned that popcorn, when heated too quickly or at too high of a temperature, can cause oil to splatter, which was exactly what had happened. So yeah, lesson learned, popcorn is a sneaky little killer. From that day on, I've been much more careful in the kitchen. I got myself a fire extinguisher too, because I'm not about to go through that nightmare again. And as for stovetop popcorn, let's just say I'm sticking to the microwave version from now on. The scariest part of the whole thing was how fast it happened. One tiny mistake. Lifting that lid could have cost me my house, or worse, my life. I'd never been so close to a fire like that, and it was terrifying to realize how quickly everything could have gone up in flames. Fire doesn't care about your plans. It just takes over, and in seconds, everything you've got can be gone. So, here's my advice. If you're going to make stovetop popcorn or cook with oil in general, pay attention. And for the love of all things good, keep a fire extinguisher in your kitchen. Trust me, you do not want to be the person standing outside your house, watching smoke pour out of your windows, all because of a stupid bowl of popcorn. Stay safe, folks. And remember, even something as simple as snack time can turn deadly if you're not careful. I've always prided myself on being a skeptic. You know, the kind of person who dismisses wild claims with a wave of the hand. UFO sightings, ghost stories, conspiracy theories. They were all just figments of people's imaginations, ways to explain things they didn't understand. I was sure of that, until something happened that I still can't explain. It's the kind of thing that makes you question reality itself. It all started a few months ago when my friend and I decided to go on a weekend road trip. We weren't going anywhere specific, just driving to get away from the stress of life for a few days. We picked a rural area, one of those places you don't find on a tourist map, where you can drive for hours and barely see another soul. The first day was perfect, clear skies, winding roads through forests and fields. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere, and that was exactly what we wanted. By the second day, we were deep into the countryside, miles away from the nearest town, when we decided to take a detour. We'd seen a small dirt road leading off the main highway, and being the adventurous types we were, we figured why not. The road wasn't on any of our maps, and our phones had no service, but we didn't care. We were just exploring. After about half an hour, the road narrowed into a single lane, and the trees around us started to close in. their branches hanging low over the car. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I remember looking at my friend and saying something like, "This feels like the start of a horror movie." We laughed it off, but there was an unspoken tension between us. Something about the place felt wrong. That's when we saw it, a small, rundown gas station up ahead. It was like something out of another time. The pumps were old, the kind with the spinning numbers, and the building looked like it hadn't seen any customers in years. There were no cars, no signs of life, but a single dim light flickered above the door. We hadn't seen another building for miles, so we figured we might as well stop, stretch our legs, and maybe grab a drink. As we pulled in, I noticed something strange. There were no windows on the building, just the door with that weak light hanging over it. The place was eerily silent, and even though the sun was still setting, it felt darker somehow, like the light didn't reach this part of the woods. We got out of the car, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't gas or oil or anything you'd expect from a place like this. It was musty, like old wood mixed with something metallic. My friend walked up to the door and knocked, just to see if anyone was inside. No answer. I was about to suggest we just leave when the door creaked open on its own. There was no one behind it. We both froze, staring into the dim interior. It was pitch black inside, with only the faintest glimmer of light coming from what looked like an old refrigerator in the corner. The air coming out of the building was cold, unnaturally cold for a summer evening. "I don't like this," I muttered. My friend agreed, and we decided to leave right then and there. As we turned to go back to the car, we heard a faint humming sound like static coming from inside the gas station. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, almost like the sound of an old radio tuned to a dead station. Against my better judgment, I turned back to look. I don't know why, but something made me glance inside the gas station one more time. That's when I saw them. In the back corner, barely visible in the shadows, were two figures. They weren't moving, just standing there, motionless, as if they were waiting for something. My heart nearly stopped when I realized they were facing us. I couldn't make out their faces, but I knew they were watching. I grabbed my friend's arm, and we bolted for the car. We didn't even bother closing the door behind us. The engine roared to life, and we sped out of there faster than I thought was possible on that narrow dirt road. We didn't stop driving until we were back on the main highway, miles away from that place. We didn't say a word the whole time. There was no need to. We both knew what we saw, those figures standing in the dark, watching us. We tried to find a gas station on the map later, but it didn't exist. We drove that same route a few weeks later out of morbid curiosity, but the road where we'd taken the detour was gone. I'm not saying it was blocked or closed off. I mean, it didn't exist anymore. There was no turnoff, no sign, no dirt road leading into the woods. It was like that whole area had never been there in the first place. I don't know what we saw that day. Maybe it was some kind of glitch in reality, or maybe that gas station was something we weren't meant to find. All I know is that those figures weren't human. They couldn't have been, and I'm terrified to think about what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint static humming in the back of my mind. And when I do, I wonder if that gas station is still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next unlucky travelers to stumble across it. This happened when I was 16, and honestly, it still freaks me out to this day. I try not to think about it too much, but every now and then it pops back into my head, especially when I'm driving alone at night. I guess that's what happens when you come face to face with something you can't explain. It was late August, just before school was supposed to start again. My family had gone up to our cabin for one last weekend getaway before summer officially ended. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, up in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest, about a 45-minute drive to the nearest town. We'd had the place for years, and I'd spent a lot of time there growing up. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, and the best part was that it was far away from everything. No phone service, no internet, no distractions. Just nature. My parents were both early risers, so they would go to bed pretty early, leaving me to do whatever I wanted in the evenings. I usually spent those nights either reading or watching old DVDs on this tiny TV we kept in the living room. But on this particular night, I was feeling restless. I don't know why, but I just couldn't sit still. So, around 11 p.m., I decided to go for a drive. Now, I know what you're thinking. What kind of idiot goes for a drive in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere? but I'd done it before. The road leading up to the cabin was one of those long, winding mountain roads that barely anyone used, so I figured I'd take a quick drive, clear my head, and be back before anyone even noticed I was gone. I grabbed the keys to my dad's old truck and headed out. It was a clear night, and the moon was bright enough to light up the road without needing the headlights, but I kept them on anyway. The trees on either side of the road were tall and thick, and the shadows they cast made the road feel like it was stretching on forever. The only sounds were the rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, but also a little eerie, being out there alone. After driving for about 10 minutes, I came to a fork in the road. To the right was the way back to town, and to the left was a road I hadn't taken before. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to go left. I guess I was feeling adventurous or maybe just bored, but I figured I'd explore a bit before heading back. The road was narrower, bumpier, and a lot less maintained. It felt like no one had driven down it in ages. The trees seemed to close in around the truck, their branches hanging low like they were trying to reach out and grab me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The farther I drove, the more that feeling grew, like there was something just beyond the trees watching me. About 15 minutes down the road, the truck started acting up. It was an old thing, so this wasn't exactly a surprise, but it chose the worst possible time to start sputtering. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned the engine off, hoping it was just overheating or something simple. I sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting. But the feeling didn't go away. After a few minutes, I decided to give the truck another shot. I turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. Great. I tried again, but all I got was this weak clicking sound. I was stuck, in the middle of nowhere, in the dark. I sat there for a second, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about walking back, but I wasn't even sure how far I'd driven, and the idea of being out in the woods alone at night wasn't exactly appealing. My phone was useless, of course, no service. So, I did the only thing I could do. I stayed in the truck and waited, hoping the engine would cool down or that some random Good Samaritan would come along and help me out. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the trees to my right. Something big. I turned my head, squinting through the window, trying to get a better look. For a few seconds, I didn't see anything, just the dense shadows cast by the trees and the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the branches. But then it moved again. Something was there, just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out, but I could see the outline of it, tall, almost humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its arms were long and gangly. Its legs bent at strange angles, and its head was too small for its body, like it had been squished or shrunken. I blinked, telling myself it wasn't real, that I was just seeing things in the dark. But when I looked again, it was still there. And it was closer. I don't know how long I stared at it, frozen in my seat. I wanted to move, to start the truck, to do something, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panic gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that thing. Then it stepped forward. It moved so slowly, almost deliberately, like it knew I was watching it and wanted to draw it out. Every part of my body was screaming at me to move, to run, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at this thing as it crept closer and closer to the truck. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The thing stood there, maybe 20 feet from the truck, just staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking right at me. It felt like time had slowed down, like the world had shrunk to just me and this creature. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared to life. I don't know how or why, but the sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I slammed my foot on the gas, not even thinking, and the truck lurched forward. I didn't look back. I didn't care if the road was bumpy or if I hit a tree. I just needed to get out of there. I don't know how fast I was going, but it felt like I was flying. The trees blurred past me, and all I could hear was the sound of the engine and the blood rushing in my ears. I kept my eyes on the road, too scared to check the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I ran inside, locked every door and window, and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They thought I was just spooked from being out in the woods alone at night. They laughed it off, saying it was probably a deer or some animal I mistook for something else. But I know what I saw, and whatever it wasn't an animal. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I made up some excuse every time my family planned a trip there, but the truth is I can't go back. I don't want to be anywhere near those woods. Not after what I saw. All right, buckle up. My first day in the industry was a train wreck with a side of unexpected empowerment. I wasn't someone who ever thought they'd end up dancing for money, but life has a funny way of pushing you into corners you didn't see coming. So, here's how it started. I was 23, juggling 2 part-time jobs that barely paid my rent. My degree in psychology was doing nothing for me, and after months of job hunting and rejection emails, I was starting to panic. I had bills piling up, a car that needed repairs, and the looming possibility of having to move back in with my parents. A thought that haunted me more than anything else. One night, I was out for drinks with my friend Claire, who casually mentioned she was making bank working at a strip club. "You should try it," she said, like she was suggesting I apply to Starbucks or something. I laughed it off at first, thinking there was no way I could do what she was doing. But the seed was planted. After a few more weeks of my financial situation getting worse, I finally texted her, asking for more details. I figured, what the hell? At this point, what did I have to lose? Claire gave me the name of the club where she worked and told me to come in and talk to the manager. She said it was an audition, but all I could think was, audition? For what? To embarrass myself. But desperate times, right? So, I swallowed my pride and showed up. The club itself was nicer than I expected. Not fancy, but not as sleazy as I imagined either. The manager, a woman named Tasha, called me into her office, which was really just a small room with a desk, a couch, and a million framed photos of her with random celebrities. She was intimidating, mid-40s, perfectly made up, and clearly a no-nonsense type. She didn't waste time with small talk. She asked me a few questions, barely glanced at my ID, and then told me to show her what I had. Just like that, I had no idea what I was doing. I'd worn a lacy black bodysuit under a skirt and jacket, thinking I was being sexy, but I felt like a fraud. My heels were cheap, my legs were shaking, and the whole time I was trying to figure out if I was going to make a fool of myself or run out of there before I even got started. The audition was in the empty club, just Tasha and a bartender setting up for the night. I stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding me, and clutched the pole like it was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. The music started, some generic club beat, and I just froze. I swayed a little, tried to look seductive, but in my head, I was screaming. I didn't know how to dance on a pole. I barely knew how to walk in heels. Tasha watched for about 2 minutes, then called it. "All right, you'll get better. You start tomorrow. Bring better shoes." Wait, what? I got the job? I didn't even know if I wanted the job, but now I was in it. That next night, I showed up in slightly better heels, ones Claire had lent me, and it felt like I was walking into a completely different world. The club was packed, the lights were flashing, and the music was deafening. I met the other girls in the dressing room. Most of them were either sizing me up or ignoring me completely. Claire was there, thankfully, and she helped calm my nerves. "Just fake it," she said. "No one's expecting you to be a pro on your first night. Smile, act confident, and don't let anyone touch you unless you want them to." Easy for her to say. My first stage set? Well, if you thought my audition was bad, this was worse. I had about 20 sets of eyes on me, and I could feel every single one of them judging me. I tried to copy what I'd seen the other girls do. Sexy spins, swaying hips, a little hair flip, but I was so stiff I looked more like a malfunctioning robot than a dancer. A few guys tossed some singles at me, but mostly they just stared or talked among themselves. I was mortified. After I stumbled off stage, Claire found me in the dressing room, my hands shaking so bad I could barely fix my makeup. "That was rough," she said, not unkindly. "But you'll get better. Just keep going." I didn't feel better. I felt like I wanted to crawl under a rock. But then came the lap dances. The first guy who asked for a dance was this middle-aged dude who was clearly drunk, but harmless enough. I sat with him for a minute before the dance started, and he was actually nice. He asked if it was my first night, and when I nodded, He smiled and said, "You'll do great." It was weirdly comforting. The dance itself wasn't as awkward as I expected. He kept his hands to himself, tipped me well, and when it was over, I actually felt good. Not great, but like, hey, maybe I can do this. The second guy, though? Ugh. He was a nightmare. He reeked of booze and cologne and had this sleazy smile that instantly made my skin crawl. As soon as the dance started, his hands were everywhere. I tried moving them away a few times, but he wasn't getting the hint. Eventually, I just stood up, said the dance was over, and walked away. He got mad, complained to the manager, but thankfully, Tasha had my back. She told him off and told me to always trust my gut when it came to customers. I appreciated that, even though I still felt shaken. By the end of the night, I had made around $150 in tips. Not amazing, but definitely more than I made in a week in my retail job. And despite the nerves, the awkwardness, and the occasional gross customer, I started to see the appeal. The money was there, the independence was there, and there was something kind of empowering about the whole experience, even if I didn't realize it yet. I went back the next night, and the next. Each time I got a little better. I learned how to walk in those damn heels without looking like a baby deer, figured out how to work the pole without clinging to it for dear life, and started to understand how to interact with customers in a way that didn't make me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of nights when I went home feeling like I was in way over my head, but I pushed through. Eventually, I got the hang of it. I learned how to separate the job from my self-worth, how to protect my energy from the creeps, and how to make real money without compromising my boundaries. I even started having fun with it sometimes, which is something I never thought I'd say. Some of the customers were actually decent people, guys who just wanted a break from their lives, someone to talk to for a few minutes. Not all of them were sleazy. I danced for about a year before I decided to move on. By the end, I had paid off a chunk of my debt, saved up a bit, and even started thinking about what I wanted to do with my life instead of just surviving. The experience taught me a lot, not just about the industry, but about myself. I learned how to be confident, how to set boundaries, and how to take control of my life, even in the craziest of situations. So yeah, my first day was a disaster, but it was the start of something that changed me for the better. I wouldn't trade it for anything. This one still feels like a fever dream, but I swear it really happened. So, it was during my senior year, right around the time when everyone was getting restless. You know how it is. People start feeling invincible because graduation's just around the corner, and it's like, what's the worst they can do? Suspend us? That was definitely the vibe of my school, and no one embodied that energy more than this guy named Ethan. Ethan was one of those guys who somehow managed to be both the class clown and the golden boy. Everyone loved him. Students, teachers, even the janitors. He was constantly pulling off pranks that should have gotten him in serious trouble, but he always flashed that charming grin, and somehow he'd walk away unscathed. So naturally, when he announced that he had the prank to end all pranks, we were all ears. Here's how it started. Our school had this big end-of-year assembly every year. It was supposed to be this motivational, feel-good thing where teachers gave speeches about the bright future ahead of us, and there was always some slideshow with cheesy music showing photos from the year. It was super boring and predictable, so Ethan decided he was going to spice it up. His idea? Sneak a live pig into the auditorium. Now, I'm not talking about a cute little piglet you'd see at a petting zoo. I'm talking about a full-grown, mud-covered farm pig. Don't ask me how Ethan came up with this or where he even found a pig, but by the time the assembly rolled around, he had everything set. The plan was to sneak the pig into the auditorium while everyone was distracted by the speeches, then let it loose right in the middle of the principal's big future is bright monologue. At first, we all thought he was joking. I mean, where do you even get a pig? But Ethan wasn't kidding. He had a cousin who lived on a farm a couple of towns over, and apparently, they had this old pig named Harold that they didn't mind lending out for some chaos. So, Ethan and a couple of his friends made the trip to the farm the night before, loaded Harold into the back of a truck, and brought him to school. The morning of the assembly, Ethan was walking around like he had just pulled off a bank heist. He was giddy, practically bouncing down the halls, whispering to anyone who'd listen about how Harold was ready to rock. His plan was foolproof, or so he thought. When the assembly started, everything was going according to plan. We were all sitting in the gym, pretending to pay attention to the speeches, while Ethan and his crew were outside, trying to figure out how to get Harold into the building without anyone noticing. The pig was in the back of the truck, covered in mud, making these low, grunting noises that in hindsight probably should have been a red flag. But Ethan? He was determined. Finally, during one of the longer speeches, they made their move. I'm still not sure how they managed to get a 200-pound pig past the main doors without anyone seeing, but somehow they did it. A couple of kids kept lookout, while Ethan and his friends wheeled Harold down the hallway in this janky, makeshift cart they'd stolen from the janitor's closet. Now here's where things started to go wrong. You see, pigs aren't exactly known for being cooperative, and Harold was no exception. As soon as they got him to the back of the gym, he decided he wasn't having any of it. The pig started thrashing around, kicking over chairs, and making these loud, snorting noises that echoed through the whole hallway. By the time they finally got him to the side entrance of the gym, Harold was in full-on rebellion mode. Inside the gym, we were all watching the slideshow when suddenly we heard this loud crash. Everyone turned to look just as the doors at the back of the gym swung open, and there was Ethan, standing there with a wild look in his eyes, holding the reins to a mud-covered, freaked-out pig. Harold barreled into the gym like a runaway freight train, squealing at the top of his lungs. For a moment, no one moved. It was like the entire school was collectively trying to process what they were seeing. Then, all hell broke loose. Harold darted straight down the middle aisle, knocking over chairs and sending people diving out of the way. The principal, who had been in the middle of his speech, just stood there frozen, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Teachers were shouting, kids were screaming, and Harold? He was just living his best life, sprinting around the gym, leaving a trail of mud and chaos in his wake. At one point, Harold veered off course and ran straight toward the cheerleading squad, who were sitting near the front. They scattered like bowling pins, shrieking as the pig skidded across the polished gym floor. One of them tried to jump onto the stage to escape, but she didn't make it. Harold clipped her leg, and she went flying into the podium, knocking over the principal's microphone. By this point, everyone was either standing on their chairs or running for the exits. But Ethan? He was dying of laughter. He was bent over, wheezing, barely able to stand, while Harold continued his rampage. I swear, it was like watching a live-action cartoon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gym teacher, Mr. Rogers, who was this huge ex-Marine, stepped in. He marched right up to Harold like he was about to wrestle a bear, grabbed the pig by the scruff of its neck, and somehow managed to wrangle it into submission. The entire gym erupted into applause like we'd just watched a WWE match. Of course, after the dust settled, we all knew Ethan was in for it. He got dragged to the principal's office, covered in mud and still grinning like a fool. The rumor was that he got suspended for the rest of the year, but honestly, I think that was a small price to pay for what became the most legendary senior prank in our school's history. For the next few weeks, all anyone could talk about was the pig incident. Harold the pig became an instant school mascot, way more popular than our actual mascot, which was just a guy in a dumb costume. There were memes, hashtags, and even t-shirts with Harold, class of 20XX, printed on them. It was the kind of prank that no one could ever top. Even the teachers couldn't help but laugh about it after the fact. I heard that the principal had a meeting with the school board to discuss animal-related incidents after that, which just made the whole thing even funnier. Harold was fine, by the way. He got returned to the farm, probably with some stories to tell his fellow pigs about his wild day in the big city. So yeah, that's the story of how my buddy Ethan turned the senior assembly into a pig rodeo. It was pure chaos, but it's the kind of chaos you never forget. Definitely one for the yearbooks. I've been lying to my best friend for almost a decade, and I don't know how to come clean without ruining everything. It all started back in college. My best friend and I were inseparable. We'd been through everything together. Bad relationships, late-night study sessions, road trips, and drunken heart-to-hearts. She was like a sister to me. We shared everything. Well, almost everything. The thing is, I was in love with her, and I have been for years. It started as a crush in our freshman year. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just a phase, something that would fade once I dated someone else or moved on. But it didn't. It just grew stronger. Every time she'd come over, laugh at one of my dumb jokes, or tell me about some guy she was into, it felt like someone was tightening a knot in my chest. I told myself I'd get over it, that I'd never let it affect our friendship. But it was always there, simmering just beneath the surface. For the first few years, I managed to keep it hidden pretty well. I even convinced myself that being her best friend was enough, that I didn't need anything more. But things started to change the summer before our senior year. We were spending nearly every day together, and the more time we spent, the harder it became to keep my feelings in check. One night, we were at this party, both of us pretty drunk. We were dancing, laughing, and having a great time. At one point, she pulled me aside and said, "You know, if we're both still single by 30, we should just get married." I laughed it off, but my heart was racing. She was joking, of course, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if it wasn't a joke? What if that was my chance? That night, I almost told her how I felt. We were sitting on the porch, away from the noise, just talking like we always did. I could feel the words bubbling up in my throat, ready to spill out. But then she started talking about some guy she had met, how she thought he might be the one. And just like that, I swallowed my confession and kept quiet. After that, I made a decision. I wasn't going to tell her. Ever. She was happy, and I didn't want to ruin that. I figured the best thing I could do was be her friend, support her, and keep my feelings to myself. So that's what I did. I watched her go through relationships, some good, some bad, always there to pick up the pieces when things fell apart. Every time, I'd tell myself that maybe her next relationship wouldn't work out either, and maybe then I'd get my chance. But it never came. The worst part came a few years later, when she met her current boyfriend. He's a great guy, honestly. Treats her well, makes her laugh, and they seem perfect together. But when they got serious, I felt something inside me break. I started pulling away, avoiding her calls, coming up with excuses to not hang out as much. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed to create some distance for my own sanity. But she noticed. Of course she did. She knows me better than anyone. One night, she confronted me about it. She asked me why I'd been so distant, why I wasn't as involved in her life anymore. I panicked. I couldn't tell her the truth, so I made up some story about being stressed with work and needing some space to figure things out. She didn't buy it completely, but she let it go, and we moved on. I thought maybe the distance would help, that maybe I'd finally get over her if I wasn't around her as much. But it didn't work. If anything, the feelings just got worse. And now, she's getting engaged. She called me last month, so excited, telling me all about how her boyfriend proposed and how she couldn't wait for me to be her maid of honor. I could hear the joy in her voice, and I wanted to be happy for her. I really did. But all I felt was this crushing sense of loss, like I'd missed my chance forever. I've been avoiding her ever since. I keep making excuses about work, pretending I'm too busy to meet up, but the truth is, I don't know if I can handle being part of her wedding. The thought of standing next to her, watching her marry someone else, is more than I can bear. But what am I supposed to do? Tell her the truth now? After all these years? It would devastate her. She'd never forgive me for lying to her, for keeping something like this from her for so long. And even if I did tell her, what good would it do? She's happy. She's in love. Telling her wouldn't change anything except maybe ruin our friendship for good. I've thought about just disappearing, ghosting her before the wedding, cutting all ties, and moving to a different city. It sounds extreme, but sometimes I think it's the only way to get out of this without causing her pain. But that would destroy her too. I can't just walk away from her life after everything we've been through together. So, I'm stuck. Stuck in this lie, stuck in this friendship that feels like both the best and worst thing in my life. I don't know how to be around her without it hurting, but I don't know how to not be around her either. I feel like I'm trapped in this endless cycle of pretending everything's fine when inside I'm falling apart. I don't know what's going to happen when the wedding day comes. I'll probably put on the best fake smile I can muster, stand by her side, and watch her marry someone else, knowing I'll never be the one she chooses. And then I'll go home alone and keep pretending like I'm okay. But the truth is, I'm not okay. I haven't been for a long time, and I don't know if I ever will be. This happened to me about 7 or 8 years ago when I was in college. I went to school in a small town, the kind of place where nothing exciting really ever happens. It was a sleepy little area, with the campus being the main hub of activity. During the week, the town felt lively, with students filling the streets and local cafes. But on weekends, especially when the weather got colder, it was like the whole place shut down. Most people either went home or stayed inside. That's when things always fell off. One Friday night, a group of us decided to stay in and have a movie night at my friend Emily's apartment. It was me, her roommate Jess, and another friend, Greg. Emily and Jess lived in this old, creaky building that had been turned into student housing, and while it wasn't the nicest place, it was big and close to campus. It was on the edge of town, near a stretch of woods that led to one of the larger parks. I didn't love the idea of walking there alone at night, but since Greg and I were coming from the same direction, we headed over together. We got there around 8 p.m., ordered some pizza, and started watching movies. It was a pretty typical night, nothing out of the ordinary. The apartment was warm, we had snacks, and we were all sprawled out on the couch, joking around between movies. By the time the second movie ended, it was after midnight, and we were all pretty tired. Greg decided to head back to his place, which was just a block away from Emily's, and Jess had already gone to bed. Emily offered to let me crash on the couch, but I was stubborn. I told her I'd be fine walking home. It was only a 15-minute walk through the park, and I'd done it a million times before. She raised an eyebrow, clearly thinking I was crazy, but I just laughed it off. I was 20 years old, feeling invincible, and I wasn't about to be scared off by a walk through the park. I said my goodbyes, grabbed my jacket, and headed out into the chilly night. The streets were dead silent, no cars, no people. Just that kind of eerie quiet you only get in small towns late at night. The only light came from a few street lights and the moon, which was just barely peeking through some clouds. I shoved my hands into my pockets and picked up my pace, trying to convince myself that I wasn't bothered by how empty everything felt. The walk started out fine. I took the usual path through the park, which was a shortcut that cut about 5 minutes off the trip back to my dorm. I've always been a night person, so being outside late didn't usually bother me. But as soon as I crossed into the park, I started to feel uneasy. The kind of uneasy where the hairs on your arms stand up and your whole body is on alert, even though there's nothing technically wrong. I brushed it off at first. It was late, and I was tired, so I told myself I was just being paranoid. But the further I walked into the park, the worse that feeling got. It was like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing around, trying to shake the sense that someone or something was watching me. The path wound through a small cluster of trees before opening up near a playground, and every time I passed a shadow or heard the wind rustling the leaves, I swore I saw movement. I pulled my phone out of my pocket just to have something to hold on to and kept walking. But as I got closer to the playground, I heard a noise that stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual rustling of leaves. It was a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps, but slow, deliberate. I turned around quickly, scanning the area behind me, but I didn't see anyone. The path was empty. The park was empty. But that sound, it was unmistakable. Someone was there. For a moment, I thought maybe Greg had decided to follow me and mess with me. He was always pulling pranks, so I figured this was his way of trying to scare me. I called out, "Greg, is that you?" Silence. The footsteps stopped. Nothing moved. I stood there, heart pounding, my eyes darting around the shadows. I tried to laugh it off, convinced Greg was hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to jump out. But then the footsteps started again, this time closer. The shuffling sound was uneven, almost like whoever or whatever it was limping. At that moment, every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I turned on my heel and started speed walking toward the playground, planning to cut through it and take the longer path back toward the well-lit streets. As I approached the playground, I could hear the footsteps speeding up behind me, getting closer, matching my pace. My breath quickened, and I felt a surge of adrenaline as I broke into a run. I didn't care how ridiculous I looked. I just needed to get out of there. I sprinted through the playground, my shoes slamming against the pavement as I rounded the swings and headed toward the street. The whole time, I could hear those footsteps behind me, still following, still there. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I reached the edge of the park, where the trees opened up into the main road. The second my feet hit the sidewalk, I stopped and turned around, panting, trying to catch my breath. But the moment I looked back, I felt that familiar chill crawl up my spine. There was no one there. The park was empty. The path I'd just run down was completely still, as if nothing had happened. No footsteps, no shadows, no movement at all. It was like whoever, or whatever, had been following me had vanished the moment I stepped out of the park. I stood there for a minute, heart racing, trying to make sense of what just happened. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired, and my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. I knew I wasn't alone in that park. I practically jogged the rest of the way back to my dorm, not daring to slow down until I was inside, with the door locked behind me. I never told Emily or Greg what happened because I knew they'd just laugh it off or tell me I was being paranoid. But I haven't walked through that park at night since. I always take the long way around now, no matter how late it is. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I listened to my gut, and I'm pretty sure that's the only reason I made it home. Alright, buckle up, because this is the story of how I almost died twice in the span of a few minutes, all because of something as ordinary as a lawnmower. It was summer, and I was feeling productive. You know, one of those rare weekends where you're in the mood to knock out all the house chores and feel like a functioning adult. I decided it was time to finally mow the lawn, which had gotten way out of hand. The grass was practically knee-high, and my old push mower was going to have its work cut out for it. Now, I'm no stranger to mowing the lawn. I've been doing it since I was a kid, so I didn't think twice about it. Grabbed the mower, yanked the starter cord, and got to work. It was one of those old gas-powered beasts, the kind that's practically indestructible, but also weighs a ton and sounds like a helicopter taking off. As I'm making my way across the yard, the sun beating down on me, I notice the grass is a little thicker than usual. No big deal, just gonna take a few more passes. About halfway through the yard, I hit a patch of really thick grass. The mower starts sputtering, struggling to cut through it. Instead of stopping and adjusting the height like a normal person, I decide to muscle through it. I push harder, forcing the mower through the grass, thinking I can just power my way to the other side. Bad idea. All of a sudden, there's a loud clank. The mower lurches forward, then dies. My first thought is that I've hit a rock or a tree root. I lean down to check under the deck, but can't see anything, so I tilt the mower back a bit to get a better look. Big mistake. What I didn't realize was that, even though the mower had shut off, the blades were still spinning, and in my infinite wisdom, I had my hand way too close to them. I wasn't even thinking about it, just focused on figuring out what had gone wrong. Before I knew it, my fingers brushed the edge of the blade, and I felt this sudden jolt of pain shoot up my hand. I pulled my hand back, so fast I almost fell over. Heart pounding? I looked down at my hand, fully expecting to see half my fingers gone, but somehow, they were all still there. I'd only grazed the blade, but I could already see blood welling up from a nasty cut on my index finger. It wasn't deep enough to do serious damage, but it was enough to scare the hell out of me. I stood there, holding my bleeding hand, thinking about how easily I could have lost a few fingers in that split second of stupidity. But that's not where this story ends. No, the lawnmower wasn't done with me yet. So, there I am, standing in the yard trying to stop my hand from bleeding when I hear this faint hissing sound. I glance down and see smoke. Actual smoke, coming from the base of the mower. My first thought is, well, that's not good. But before I can even process what's happening, the damn thing catches fire. No joke, flames start licking out from underneath the engine, right where the gas tank is. Now I'm panicking. I'm standing there, bleeding from my hand, staring at my flaming lawnmower, and all I can think is, this thing is about to explode in my face. I've seen enough movies to know that gas tanks and fire do not mix, so I do the only thing I can think of. I take off running. And not in a dignified way. I mean full-on sprinting across the yard like my life depends on it, because at this point it kind of does. I make it to the other side of the yard and duck behind a tree, peeking out like I'm in some sort of action movie. The mower is still on fire, but it hasn't exploded yet, so I start looking around for something, anything to put it out. Of course, I'd left the garden hose rolled up on the other side of the yard, because why would I be prepared for this kind of situation? So I sprint back across the yard, grab the hose, and frantically unravel it. By the time I get the water going, the flames are getting bigger, and I'm fully expecting this thing to blow up any second. I doused the mower with water, soaking the entire thing until the flames finally die down. Smoke is still pouring out of it, and the smell of burnt grass and oil fills the air. I'm standing there, drenched in sweat and out of breath, just staring at the charred remains of my lawnmower like, what the hell just happened? Once the adrenaline wore off, I realized just how close I'd come to having a really bad day. If I hadn't noticed the smoke when I did, or if the gas tank had caught fire, I could have been seriously hurt, or worse. And all of it because I got too lazy to adjust the height of the mower. After that, I called it quits for the day. Went inside, bandaged my hand, and cracked open a beer. I'd had enough excitement for one afternoon. The lawn didn't get finished, but at that point I didn't care. Better an overgrown yard than missing fingers or a backyard explosion. So yeah, here's my lesson for the day. Don't mess around with lawnmowers. It might seem like a simple task, but those machines are no joke. If it stops working, don't be an idiot like me. Stop and check it properly. And for the love of God, keep your hands away from the blades. Even if the motor's off, those blades can still cut through bone like butter. Oh, and maybe keep a fire extinguisher handy, just in case. I've always been a logical person. I don't fall for ghost stories or conspiracy theories. I believe in facts and science and things I can touch and see. But what happened to me last year completely shattered that belief. I haven't told many people about this because, honestly, I'm not sure they believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believe me. But here it goes. It started with a trip to my hometown. I hadn't been back in years, not since I'd left for college and moved to the city. But my mom called and told me that the old house was finally being sold. We needed to clean it out. The house had been in our family for generations, so it was full of old junk, my grandparents' things, my parents' things, and even some stuff dating back to my great-grandparents. It was a mess, but I was kind of looking forward to going through it all. The first day was fine, a bit emotional, digging through old photo albums and forgotten mementos, but nothing strange. It wasn't until the second day that things started to get off. I was in the attic, sorting through a stack of old papers, when I found a small, wooden box. It was unmarked, kind of dusty, and tucked away in a corner I almost missed. I opened it up, expecting to find old letters or maybe some photos, but what I found inside was a notebook. Not the kind you'd buy at a store, though. This one looked handmade. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in decades. I flipped through it and quickly realized it wasn't full of recipes or family history like I expected. It was a journal, but not like any journal I'd ever seen. The entries were short, erratic, almost frantic. At first, they seemed like random thoughts or observations about the weather, chores, things like that. But the deeper I got into the notebook, the more disturbing it became. One entry stood out. It was written in shaky handwriting, as if whoever wrote it was scared. It simply said, "It watches me while I sleep." I remember laughing at that, thinking it must have been a joke, or maybe my great-grandfather's way of messing with someone. But then I kept reading. The entries became more and more unsettling, describing strange sounds in the night, shadows moving when no one else was around, and a feeling of being constantly watched. The last entry was the worst. The handwriting was almost illegible, like the person had been in a rush to get it down. It read, "I hear it breathing. It's in the house. I need to leave, but it won't let me." I shut the notebook, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought about tossing it into the trash and forgetting I'd ever seen it. But something about it nagged at me. The dates in the notebook were from the early 1900s. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. I decided to ask my mom about it later. That night, I stayed in the house alone. My mom had gone to stay with a friend since the house was almost empty, and I figured one last night in my childhood home would be kind of nostalgic. Big mistake. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like something was moving in the walls. At first, I thought it was just mice or something, but then it got louder and closer. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as soon as I moved. The room was dead silent. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. I lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, just as I started to drift back to sleep, I heard it, breathing. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A low, steady inhale and exhale like someone or something was standing just outside my bedroom door. My blood went cold. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just spooking myself after reading that creepy journal. But the sound didn't stop. It stayed, lingering in the air. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in bed, listening to that horrible breathing. It felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to get up and check the door. My hands were shaking as I opened it, half expecting to find someone standing there. But there was no one. The hallway was empty, the house silent again. I checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. No signs of anyone else being in the house. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I packed up and left the house without saying a word to anyone. I didn't even mention the notebook. I just left it there, buried under piles of old papers where I found it, hoping that whatever it was, it would stay there. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I imagined the breathing, that the notebook was just a relic of some ancestor with an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I heard, and I know what I felt. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something from that house followed me. Every now and then, late at night, I swear I hear it again, that same soft breathing just outside my bedroom door. Let me set the scene for you. It was a regular Saturday afternoon, nothing too exciting, just one of those lazy weekends where you run errands, do some chores, and maybe kick back with a drink in the evening. I was at home, minding my own business, putting up some shelves in the garage. I've been meaning to do it for a while, so I finally decided to knock it out that day. I'm not exactly what you'd call a handyman, but I'm competent enough, at least that's what I thought. So there I was, standing on this old, wobbly ladder, screwing in brackets for the shelf. Everything was going fine until I reached for my drill, which was just slightly out of my reach. Now, instead of being smart and getting off the ladder to grab it, I did what every overconfident idiot does. I leaned. And that's when everything went wrong. The ladder tipped to the side. Instantly, I knew I was screwed. I tried to grab onto the shelf I'd just installed, but the thing wasn't secure enough to hold me. It ripped right out of the wall, and before I knew it, I was in free fall. Now, falling off a ladder might not seem like a big deal. It's not like I was working 20 feet in the air or anything, but let me tell you, you don't need to be that high off the ground for things to go sideways fast. I crashed down hard. My right foot landed first, twisting in a way no foot is supposed to twist, and I heard this sickening crack. The rest of my body followed, slamming into the concrete floor of the garage. For a moment, I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, dazed and in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Then the pain hit, white-hot, blinding pain shooting up from my ankle all the way to my hip. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. My leg felt like it was on fire, and I could barely breathe from the impact. My first thought, stupidly, was, okay, maybe I just sprained it. But then I looked down at my foot, and it was twisted in the wrong direction. Like completely the wrong direction. That's when the panic set in. I reached for my phone, which had somehow skidded across the floor during the fall, but I couldn't get to it. It was just out of arm's reach. Typical, right? At this point, I'm starting to sweat, realizing that I might actually be stuck here, lying on my garage floor with a broken ankle and no way to call for help. Then it hit me, nobody knows I'm here. My wife was out of town visiting her family for the weekend, and I hadn't told anyone I was working in the garage. If I couldn't get to my phone, I was screwed. I lay there for what felt like hours, trying not to freak out, but my ankle was swelling fast, and the pain was getting worse by the second. Every time I tried to move, it felt like someone was jabbing a knife into my leg. At one point, I thought about trying to drag myself across the floor to get to my phone, but even the slightest movement sent waves of agony through me. I was completely helpless. Now, I don't know if it was adrenaline, desperation, or just plain stubbornness, but after what must have been 20 or 30 minutes, I finally managed to inch my way across the floor, using my arms to pull myself along like some pathetic action movie hero who just survived a plane crash. I grabbed my phone and, with shaking hands, called 911. The paramedics showed up pretty quickly, but let me tell you, nothing humbles you faster than having to be carried out of your garage on a stretcher because you were too stupid to get off a ladder properly. They rushed me to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed what I already knew. I'd broken my ankle in 3 places, and I was going to need surgery to fix it. Now, I know what you're thinking. A broken ankle? Big deal, right? But here's the thing. It wasn't just the break that almost did me in. It was everything that came after. The surgery went fine, but during my recovery, I ended up with a blood clot in my leg. Apparently, when you're lying around with your leg in a cast for weeks on end, not moving much, you're at a higher risk for clots. At first, I didn't even realize what was happening. My leg started swelling up again, but I figured it was just part of the healing process. Then one night, about a week after the surgery, I woke up with this sharp stabbing pain in my chest. I couldn't breathe. It felt like someone was sitting on my rib cage, and I was gasping for air. My wife freaked out, called 911, and the paramedics rushed me to the ER. Turns out, that blood clot had traveled from my leg to my lungs, causing a pulmonary embolism. The doctor told me later that if I hadn't gotten to the hospital when I did, I probably would have died in my sleep. Just like that, a dumb fall off a ladder nearly killed me. Not from the fall itself, but from the chain reaction of complications that followed. I spent the next few days in the hospital, hooked up to all kinds of machines while they pumped me full of blood thinners to dissolve the clot. It was surreal, lying there, thinking about how close I'd come to dying over something as stupid as trying to reach for a drill while standing on an old, rickety ladder. Looking back, I realize how fragile life really is. You don't think about it in the moment. How one wrong move, one tiny decision, can set off a domino effect that could end your life in seconds. I could have just as easily broken my neck in that fall, or hit my head on the concrete, and been done for. But instead, I got the long, drawn-out version of almost dying, thanks to that blood clot. So yeah, here's my PSA. Don't be an idiot on ladders. Take the extra 5 seconds to get off and grab what you need. And if you ever end up in a cast for a while, pay attention to your body. Blood clots are no joke. They can take you out before you even realize what's happening. These days, I'm a lot more careful. I don't take risks like that anymore, and you better believe I replaced that old ladder with something a little more sturdy. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this whole ordeal, it's that death doesn't always come in some big, dramatic way. Sometimes, it sneaks up on you through the tiniest cracks, like a misstep on a ladder or a clot in your bloodstream, when you least expect it. So yeah, be smart, be careful, and don't end up like me, lying on the garage floor, wondering if that shelf you just installed is the last thing you'll ever see. Okay, so my first day in the industry, it was like a roller coaster that I wasn't sure I wanted to be on, but once I was strapped in, there was no turning back. To give you some context, I was 21 and broke as hell. I had been living with my parents, working at a retail job that paid barely above minimum wage, and I was stuck in this endless loop of trying to get ahead, but constantly falling behind. You know that feeling when you check your bank account, and there's just this wave of dread? Yeah, that was me. Every single month. One night, I was scrolling through social media, half-heartedly looking for jobs, when I saw a post from a girl I went to high school with. She was living the life, posting pics in expensive clothes, going on trips, and just generally looking like she was killing it. Curious, I DM'd her, asking what she was doing for work. She hit me back with, "Oh, I'm dancing at a club downtown. You should try it. It's good money." At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, dancing? Me? But the more I thought about it, the more that little seed grew. I was desperate for cash, and if she could do it and be making good money, maybe I could too. After all, how hard could it be? So, I mulled it over for a few days, trying to psych myself up. Finally, I decided, screw it, I'll give it a shot. If I hate it, I can always quit, right? I went to the club she worked at, which was only about a 20-minute drive from where I lived. From the outside, it looked like one of those gentlemen's clubs you see in movies. Dimly lit neon signs, tinted windows, and a giant bouncer standing at the door. I almost turned around right then and there, but I figured if I left now, I'd always wonder what it would have been like. Inside, the place was surprisingly clean and not as seedy as I'd imagined. There was a faint smell of perfume and a haze of smoke, but it wasn't too bad. The manager, this older guy with a thick mustache and a beer belly, waved me over and asked if I was there to audition. I nodded, suddenly feeling way out of my depth. He looked me up and down, then told me to come back that night for my first shift. No audition, no interview, just be here at 8. I spent the rest of the day freaking out, not sure what to expect. I didn't even have proper stripper clothes, so I went to the mall and bought this lacy black lingerie set and a pair of heels that I could barely walk in. My heart was pounding the whole time. I don't think I've ever been so nervous to spend money before. When I got home, I threw on the outfit, did my makeup, and stared at myself in the mirror. It was surreal. I kept thinking, am I really doing this? When I got to the club that night, it was like stepping into another world. The lights were low, the music was loud, and there were guys everywhere. The other dancers looked like they had been doing this for years. Confident, sexy, and completely at ease. I felt like a total imposter, standing there in my cheap heels and trying to act like I belonged. The manager waved me over again, told me to pick a stage name. I went with Lola because it was the first thing that popped into my head, and then threw me into the deep end. My first stage set? An absolute disaster. I mean, I didn't fall or anything, but I might as well have. I was so stiff, barely moving, gripping the pole like it was my lifeline. I kept trying to remember the moves I had seen in music videos or from watching the other girls, but nothing seemed to translate in real life. I was just awkward. Some of the guys in the front row were watching, but no one was throwing money at me. They just kind of stared, probably wondering what the hell I was doing up there. I was wondering the same thing. After my set, I rushed off stage and headed straight for the dressing room. I felt like a failure. One of the older dancers, a girl named Ruby, noticed me sulking in the corner and came over. "First time?" she asked, lighting a cigarette. I nodded, trying not to look too pathetic. She smiled and said, "Don't worry, everyone sucks on their first night. Just relax. The more confident you act, the more money you'll make. Fake it till you make it, babe." Then she handed me her lighter and said, "Here, light this for me. It's good practice for stage confidence." I laughed, but the advice actually stuck. Ruby gave me a crash course in how to work the room, how to flirt without being too forward, and how to get guys to throw down more cash without straight up asking for it. I felt like I had a mentor, someone who had been through the fire and came out the other side. That night, I did a couple of lap dances. The first guy was super chill. He just wanted me to sit with him and talk for a few minutes while he nursed a drink. Easy money. The second guy was a little more touchy-feely than I liked, but I set my boundaries and he respected them. By the end of the night, I'd made about $200, which was more than I'd ever made in a single shift at my retail job. It felt surreal walking out of that club with cash in hand. I was still reeling from the whole experience, but I couldn't deny that the money was good. I went back the next night, and the night after that, I started getting more comfortable on stage, figuring out how to move in a way that felt natural. I got better at reading customers too, knowing which ones were there to throw money and which ones were just there to gawk. It wasn't always glamorous, and there were definitely nights when I felt gross or objectified, but I kept reminding myself that this was temporary. This was a means to an end. I had a goal: get out of debt, save up some money, and get my life back on track. One of the weirdest things I learned was how much of this job is psychological. It's not just about dancing or being sexy. It's about creating a fantasy for the customer. Some guys just want someone to listen to them, to make them feel important for a few minutes. Others are just there for the visual, and that's fine too. You learn to play a role, and after a while, it almost becomes second nature. I stayed at that club for about a year, saving every dollar I could. I met some really cool girls there too, people I wouldn't have crossed paths with otherwise. There were tough nights, for sure. Nights when drunk customers crossed lines, or when the money just wasn't flowing. But I always reminded myself of why I was there. By the time I left, I had paid off my credit card debt and saved enough to move into my own place. Looking back, my first day was chaotic and nerve-wracking, but it taught me a lot. Not just about the industry, but about myself. I learned how to stand up for myself, how to hustle, and how to be confident, even when I didn't feel it. It wasn't the path I thought I'd take, but it was part of my journey, and I don't regret it. It's funny how you can look back and pinpoint the exact moment you should have known something was wrong, but at the time, you just don't. You brush it off, tell yourself you're overthinking, and move on. I think that's what hurts the most, the fact that I saw it coming and still convinced myself that everything was fine. We'd been together for almost 3 years. I'm not going to say it was perfect, because it wasn't. No relationship is, right? But it was good. We lived together, spent our weekends doing the usual couple stuff, grocery shopping, movie nights, brunch with friends. Normal things. And I thought we were in a good place, even though we'd had our share of rough patches. The first time I got that weird feeling, the one that nags at you and tells you something isn't right, was when he started going out more often without me. He'd always been social, but we usually went out together. Suddenly, he had these guys' nights, ones that didn't include me. It started once a month, then it was every other weekend, and then it was just random nights. He'd say, "I'm meeting up with the guys, don't wait up." I try to be understanding. Everyone needs time with their friends, right? But I noticed he was a lot more vague about these outings than he used to be. One night, I asked him if I could come along, thinking it'd be fun to meet his friends. He got weirdly defensive. He told me it was just a guy's thing and that I wouldn't enjoy it. I didn't push, but something about the way he said it felt off. Like he was trying too hard to keep me out of whatever he was really doing. Still, I didn't want to be that girlfriend, the one who questions everything. I trusted him, or at least I wanted to. Then there was his phone. He had always been pretty open with it. We'd sit on the couch, scroll through Instagram, show each other funny memes, normal stuff. But out of nowhere, he started keeping his phone on silent and turned face down. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when he started taking it with him to the bathroom or keeping it glued to his hand, even when we were watching TV, it became impossible to ignore. I joked about it one night, asking him if he was hiding something. He laughed it off and said he was just trying to disconnect from work, that all the notifications stressed him out. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But then, he started accusing me of being distant. I was shocked. He'd tell me I wasn't being affectionate enough, that I wasn't making an effort, that I didn't care about him as much as I used to. It came out of nowhere. We'd always been affectionate with each other, but suddenly, everything I did wasn't enough. At first, I thought maybe he was going through something, work stress, personal stuff, whatever. I tried harder to be there for him, but the more I did, the more distant he became. It was like I was chasing after someone who was slipping further and further away from me. The real kicker was when he started accusing me of cheating. I couldn't believe it. He'd say things like, "You're always on your phone," or "Who were you with last night?" As if I had suddenly turned into this sneaky, untrustworthy person. At first, I thought it was a joke, like he was messing with me. But the accusations kept coming. Every time I'd go out with friends, or even stay late at work, he'd ask these loaded questions about where I was and who I was with. It was bizarre because I hadn't changed a thing about my routine, but he acted like I was guilty of something. I learned later that people who cheat often project their guilt onto their partner. It's like they feel so guilty about what they're doing that they assume their partner must be doing the same thing. But at the time, I didn't know that. All I knew was that the man I loved and trusted was turning into a stranger. One night, after weeks of feeling like I was walking on eggshells, I finally confronted him. I asked him if something was going on, if there was someone else. His reaction was pure anger. He got defensive, started yelling about how I didn't trust him, how I was paranoid, how I was the one ruining our relationship. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I being paranoid? Was I reading too much into things? He made me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one tearing us apart. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one weekend, he told me he was going on a work trip. It wasn't unusual. He traveled for work sometimes, and I'd never had a reason to doubt him before. But this time, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. The night before he left, I saw him packing. He was so casual about it, throwing clothes into a bag, making jokes like everything was fine. But something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I didn't confront him. Instead, I waited until he left the next morning, and then I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked his laptop. It was something I had always promised myself I would never do because trust was so important to me. But I couldn't ignore my gut anymore. And there it was. His email was open, and there were messages, dozens of them, between him and someone I didn't recognize. They weren't work emails. They were personal, intimate, flirty. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the messages, reading their plans to meet up, the inside jokes, the way he talked to her in a way he hadn't talked to me in months. It had been going on for nearly a year. A year. I was in shock. The person I'd been sharing my life with, the person I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, had been living a double life for almost a year. I confronted him the day he got back. I didn't even wait for him to settle in. I held up the printouts of the emails and just stood there, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. He just stared at me, his face pale, like he'd been caught but didn't have the energy to fight it anymore. He tried to explain it, said it was a mistake, that it wasn't serious, that he still loved me and wanted to fix things. But how do you fix something that's been broken for so long without you even realizing it? How do you rebuild trust after someone you loved and trusted spent a year lying to your face? I told him to leave. I couldn't even look at him. He packed a bag and left that night, and I haven't seen him since. He tried reaching out a few times, but I blocked him. There was no going back after what he did. It's been months since then, and I'm still picking up the pieces. I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering how I didn't see it sooner, how I let myself believe that everything was fine. The signs were there. They were always there, but I ignored them because I didn't want to believe that the person I love could do that to me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's to trust your gut. When someone you love starts acting out of character, when they start hiding things or accusing you of things you know aren't true, there's a reason. You might not want to see it, but it's there. And the longer you ignore it, the worse it gets. I'm still healing, but at least I know now that I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was right all along. About 5 years ago, and to this day, I still can't figure out what exactly happened. My friends laugh it off whenever I bring it up, but I know what I saw, or at least what I think I saw. It was late November, just after Thanksgiving, and a couple of buddies and I decided to take a camping trip before the real cold set in. We'd all grown up in the same town, gone to the same high school, and now that we were out in the real world, we tried to make it a point to stay in touch. This camping trip had become a bit of a tradition for us, a weekend of hiking, fishing, drinking way too much beer, and generally pretending we were still those carefree high school kids without any responsibilities. This year we picked a new spot, someplace up in the woods that Matt, one of my friends, had heard about from a coworker. It was a few hours' drive from where we lived, and supposedly it was this great hidden gem, quiet, isolated, the perfect place to escape from everything for a while. Sounded ideal to us. The drive up there was uneventful, just a long stretch of winding roads surrounded by dense trees. As we got deeper into the woods, cell service became spotty, and by the time we reached the campsite, we were completely off the grid. No phones, no GPS, nothing. But the site itself was perfect. A clearing by a small lake, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. We set up camp, got a fire going, cracked open a few beers, and spent the afternoon fishing on the lake. It was great, just us and nature. By the time night fell, we were all feeling pretty good. A little buzzed, a little tired, but happy to be out there. We built the fire up high, threw on some more logs, and settled in for the night, telling stories and laughing like we hadn't done in years. Around midnight, we ran out of firewood. Matt and our other friend, Dave, decided to head into the woods to grab more. I offered to go with them, but they insisted they'd be fine, and I stayed behind to tend the fire. They were gone longer than I expected, and after about 20 minutes, I started to feel uneasy. You know that feeling when the air just feels different? Like it's suddenly heavy or too quiet? That's what it was like. The fire crackled softly, and the trees around me swayed a bit in the breeze, but there was something about the stillness of everything else that put me on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But then I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was Matt and Dave coming back. But the footsteps weren't coming from the direction they'd gone. They were coming from the opposite side of the clearing, just beyond the trees. Soft, deliberate, like someone or something was walking slowly through the underbrush. I stood up, peering into the darkness, trying to see what was out there. Matt? Dave? I called, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped. I strained to listen, my heart starting to race, but all I could hear was the crackle of the fire. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon scavenging for food, but something about it felt wrong, too human. I sat back down, trying to shake off the nerves, but I kept my eyes on the tree line. A few minutes later, Matt and Dave finally came back, each carrying a couple of logs. They were laughing about something, completely unaware that anything strange had happened. I didn't mention the footsteps. I didn't want to seem like I was freaking out over nothing. The rest of the night passed without incident. We threw the logs on the fire, drank a few more beers, and eventually, one by one, we crawled into our tents to sleep. That's when things got weird. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I woke up. It was pitch black inside my tent, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out why I'd woken up at all. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. Much closer. Like someone was walking right outside my tent, circling around it. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I held my breath listening. The steps were slow, methodical, crunching through the leaves just a few feet away. I thought about calling out to Matt or Dave, but something stopped me. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whatever it was to know I was awake. The footsteps continued for what felt like forever, just moving around my tent, stopping and starting again. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think straight. I just lay there, paralyzed by fear, hoping it would go away. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my body tense, expecting to hear the footsteps again, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. After a long time, I finally let myself relax, telling myself it must have been an animal or maybe one of the guys messing with me. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those footsteps, that slow, deliberate movement right outside my tent. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I told Matt and Dave what had happened. They laughed it off, of course, saying it was probably just a deer or something. But I could tell they were a little freaked out, too. We decided to head out later that afternoon, cutting the trip short. Something about the place just didn't feel right anymore. As we were packing up, I wandered over to the edge of the clearing, where I'd heard the footsteps the night before. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some tracks or a sign that an animal had been there. But what I found chilled me to the bone. There, in the soft dirt just outside the tree line, were footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot from the look of it. But here's the thing, they weren't normal. The prints were long and narrow, with toes that seemed too far apart, almost claw-like. They weren't the kind of footprints you'd expect to see out in the middle of the woods. And they were fresh. So fresh that I could make out every detail in the dirt. I called Matt and Dave over, but when they saw the prints, they went quiet. No more jokes, no more laughing it off. We all stared at the tracks in silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Without saying much, we finished packing up and got the hell out of there. None of us talked about it on the drive back, and we haven't talked about it since. Every now and then, one of us will bring up that camping trip, but we never mention the footprints. It's like an unspoken rule. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some crazy person living in the woods. Maybe it was something else entirely. I don't know, but I haven't been camping since. And I don't plan on going again anytime soon. This one is about the infamous day we tried to turn our senior year talent show into a full-blown rock concert. It was supposed to be the usual lame school event with kids doing magic tricks, dance routines, and whatever else people pretended to care about. But my buddy Dave and I, we wanted to shake things up. Dave had this old garage band, like straight-up garage band, because they practiced in his garage. And they weren't terrible, but they weren't exactly winning any Grammys either. Still, they had a decent following at school, mostly because Dave's older brother, Mark, was the lead singer and he was kind of a local legend. Mark had already graduated, but Dave thought it would be hilarious to have him crash the talent show for one final performance. You know, like a secret guest kind of thing, even though literally everyone knew who he was. We were all about the chaos, so naturally, I was down for it. The plan was simple. Dave and his band would sign up for the talent show as one of the acts, play a couple of songs to warm up the crowd, and then, during the last song, Mark would storm the stage out of nowhere, and we'd turn the whole thing into a rock concert. Seemed foolproof at the time. The day of the talent show comes, and everything is going according to plan. The acts before us were typical. Some kid played a cover of Wonderwall on the guitar, a group of freshmen did a cringeworthy skit about school lunch, and there was some weird juggling routine that lasted way too long. By the time it was our turn, the crowd was pretty much checked out. Perfect. Dave's band took the stage, and right away, you could feel the energy shift. They started off with some Green Day covers, and to my surprise, people were actually getting into it. A few kids up front were nodding their heads, and some girls from our class were pretending to be groupies, screaming and waving their arms like we were at Coachella instead of a high school gym. Everything was going fine. Then, halfway through their second song, Mark came charging in from the side of the stage, mic in hand, ready to steal the show. The crowd went nuts. Even the teachers looked kind of impressed because they all remembered Mark from his glory days. He was this tall, lanky dude with long hair and a leather jacket, and he had this presence that made it impossible to look away. Mark grabbed the mic from Dave, and before anyone knew what was happening, he started belting out the chorus of some song I'd never even heard of, but he was giving it everything. The band kept playing, and for a minute, it was like we were actually at a legit rock concert. The lights were flashing, people were jumping up and down, and it felt like we were pulling off the greatest stunt in school history. But then Mark decided to take things up a notch. There was this huge decorative banner hanging across the back of the stage that said Class of 20XX Talent Show in giant glittery letters. Mark, being the rock star wannabe that he was, thought it'd be a good idea to climb up one of the tall wooden stage pillars, grab the banner, and swing across the stage like he was Tarzan. As soon as I saw him climbing, I knew this was about to go sideways. The dude was not exactly known for thinking things through. Mark managed to grab hold of the banner, but instead of swinging gracefully like he'd imagined, the whole thing ripped out of the wall with this horrible tearing sound. He fell flat on his back in the middle of the stage, bringing the entire banner and part of the curtain down with him. The crowd went silent for a split second, and I swear, you could hear a pin drop. Then, everything exploded. Kids were screaming, laughing, some were filming it on their phones, and one of the teachers in the front row just put her hands over her face like she couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. Mark, who was somehow still holding the mic, jumped up like nothing had happened and yelled, "Rock and roll, baby." That was when the principal, Mr. Jacobs, stormed up to the stage. He was this no-nonsense, old-school guy who always wore a suit, even to the most casual school events. The second he got up there, he snatched the mic out of Mark's hand and started yelling at us to stop the music. Of course, Dave's band, being the rebellious teenage punks they were, just played louder. I honestly thought we were going to start a riot. Kids were running up to the stage. The teachers were trying to calm everyone down, and all the while, Mr. Jacobs was frantically waving his arms like a traffic cop, trying to restore some kind of order. It was chaos in the best way possible. Finally, after what felt like forever, the band stopped playing, mostly because they were out of songs, and security came in to escort Mark off the stage. They didn't drag him off, but it was close. The whole time, he was grinning like a maniac, soaking in the attention like this was the best moment of his life. As for the rest of us, well, we didn't exactly stick around to see what happened next. We knew we were in deep trouble, so we bolted out the side door as soon as the lights came back up. I remember Dave turning to me as we were running, laughing his head off, and saying, "Dude, that was epic. The fallout wasn't as bad as I thought it would be." We all got hauled into the principal's office the next day, and Mr. Jacobs gave us the standard lecture about responsibility and how we disrupted a school function. Dave's band was banned from ever performing at any school events again, which, honestly, wasn't much of a punishment since we were graduating in a couple of months. As for Mark, he got a lifetime ban from setting foot on school property, which again, didn't really matter since he'd already graduated. The real kicker, though, is that the whole thing became legendary. People still talk about it like it was the greatest talent show in our school's history. Even now, whenever I run into someone from high school, they bring up the time Mark brought down the house, literally. So yeah, that's the story of how we turned the senior talent show into a full-blown rock concert, tore down the stage, and somehow got away with it. Definitely one for the history books. I've been lying to my husband about wanting kids for our entire marriage. When we first started dating, we were both young, in our early 20s, and like most people that age, we never really got into serious discussions about family or the future. We were more focused on having fun, traveling, and enjoying life together. I wasn't even thinking about kids at the time, and honestly, I thought I'd feel differently as I got older, that maybe one day the maternal instinct would kick in like it does for everyone else. But it never did. Fast forward a few years, we got married, and the kids' talk started popping up here and there. He'd casually mention how cute our kids would be, or talk about what kind of father he wanted to be. I'd always smile, laugh it off, and say something non-committal like, "Yeah, one day." But deep down, I knew I didn't want kids. I wasn't ready to admit it to myself, though, let alone to him. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that eventually I'd feel the same way he did. That when the time came, I'd be excited to start a family. Except that never happened either. As the years went on, I started to panic. We were in our late 20s, and he was starting to talk more seriously about settling down and starting a family. He'd drop little hints here and there. When we have kids, we should teach them to play the piano, or I wonder if our kids will have your eyes. It was cute, sweet even, but every time he said something like that, I felt this pit in my stomach. I didn't know how to tell him that I didn't want the same thing. So, I did what I've been doing my whole life. I lied. I told him I wanted kids someday, that I was just focused on my career for now, that we still had plenty of time. He believed me because why wouldn't he? We were in love, and he thought we were on the same page. I thought I could keep pushing it off, that I could delay the inevitable and figure out how to deal with it later. But later came a lot sooner than I expected. 2 years ago, we had dinner with some close friends who had just had their first baby. We spent the whole evening listening to them gush about parenthood, how it changed their lives, how they couldn't wait to have more kids. My husband was glowing the whole time, making jokes about how we'd be next, how he couldn't wait to be a dad. I just sat there, smiling, pretending to be part of the conversation while feeling completely numb inside. On the way home, he turned to me and said, "So, when are we going to start our family?" I froze. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't prepared for that question. Not yet. I mumbled something about wanting to wait a little longer, about needing more time. He didn't push me on it, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. That night, I had a full-blown panic attack. I realized that I couldn't keep lying to him forever. He was ready for kids, and I wasn't. I never would be. But how could I tell him that? How could I admit that I had lied to him? That I'd been pretending to want the same future for years? I knew how much he wanted to be a dad, and I didn't want to take that away from him. But I also knew that I couldn't force myself into a life I didn't want. I started avoiding the topic altogether after that. Anytime he brought up kids, I'd change the subject or come up with some excuse about how we needed to wait until we were more financially stable, or until we moved into a bigger house, or until my career settled down. I just kept pushing the goalposts further and further, hoping he'd stop asking. But of course he didn't. A few months ago, we went to visit his family, and his mother cornered me in the kitchen, asking when she could expect grandkids. I laughed it off, told her we were working on it, but the look on her face made my skin crawl. She wasn't buying it, and I could tell. Later that night, my husband and I had one of the biggest fights of our relationship. He asked me point blank if I was ever going to be ready to have kids, and I just froze. I didn't have an answer for him, not one that wouldn't completely destroy him. So, I lied again. I told him I was just scared, that I was worried about whether we'd be good parents, that I wanted everything to be perfect before we brought a child into the world. He believed me, of course. He held me, reassured me that we'd figure it out together, that there was no rush. I cried in his arms, feeling like the worst person in the world. The truth is, I'm terrified, not of being a bad parent, but of losing him. I love him more than anything, but I know he's not going to wait forever. I see it in his eyes, the disappointment, the longing. Every time one of our friends announces they're expecting, I can see how much it hurts him, how much he wants that for us. And I'm the one standing in the way. I don't know what to do. Part of me wonders if I should just suck it up and have a baby, even though I know deep down I don't want to. But is that fair? To him? To the child? To me? Another part of me thinks I should just rip off the Band-Aid, tell him the truth, and let him decide if he wants to stay or go. But I'm scared. I'm scared that if I tell him, he'll leave me, and I can't bear the thought of losing him. I'm trapped in this lie, and the longer I keep it up, the worse it gets. I feel like I'm running out of time, like eventually I'll have to make a choice, and neither option feels right. I just keep hoping that something will change, that somehow I'll wake up one day and magically want kids. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. So, here I am, pretending that everything's fine, pretending that I want the same future he does, pretending that I'm not lying to the person I love most in the world. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but for now, I'm stuck. And I hate myself for it. This happened about 2 years ago. I had just moved to a new town for a job, and I didn't really know anyone yet. My apartment was in a small complex on the edge of town, close to this big park that everyone said was great for walking or jogging. The first couple of months, they were pretty uneventful. I spent most of my time getting settled into my new routine, trying to make friends at work, and finding my way around town. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to take a walk in the park to clear my head. It had been a rough week at work, and I needed some fresh air. The park was huge, with winding paths through woods, a pond, and a couple of playgrounds. There weren't many people out that day, probably because it was mid-October and the weather was starting to get chilly. I hadn't been walking for more than 10 minutes when I started to get this weird feeling, like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. It's easy to freak yourself out when you're in a quiet, isolated place. But the further I walked down the trail, the stronger that feeling got. You know how sometimes you just know someone's watching you, even if you can't see them? That's exactly how it felt. I stopped and looked around, but there was no one. Just trees and the empty path stretching out ahead of me. I told myself I was being silly and kept walking, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I even pulled out my phone to check for texts or something to distract myself, but there was no signal, which only made me feel worse. About halfway through the trail, there's this part where the path cuts through a thick section of woods, and as soon as I stepped into that part, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was colder in there, and the trees were so close together that it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around and go back, but I kept moving forward because I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. I was probably about 50 yards into the woods when I heard a noise behind me, a soft crunch like someone stepping on leaves. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I turned around slowly, but again, I didn't see anything. No one was there. That's when I decided I'd had enough. My walk was over. I was going home. I turned back the way I came and started walking a little faster, my eyes darting around to every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. The path back to the park entrance felt so much longer than before, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone creeping up behind me. And then I heard it again, the crunching sound, but this time it was closer. Too close. I didn't even turn around. I broke into a jog, trying to keep my cool, but the sound of footsteps followed me, picking up pace to match mine. Panic surged through me, and I took off running, my feet pounding against the gravel as I raced toward the entrance. I didn't care how it looked. I just knew I had to get out of those woods. I burst out of the tree line, my lungs burning, and didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot. There was no one there. No one. The whole park seemed deserted, and for a second, I wondered if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked at the far end of the lot, partially hidden by some trees, was a beat-up old car. The kind of car you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. And inside, slouched down in the driver's seat, was a man. He was staring straight at me. He wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything, just watching me, his eyes following me as I stood there frozen in place. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, so I quickly fumbled for my keys, jumped into my car, and sped out of the lot without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and I saw the man's car pull out of the lot too, following me at a distance. I tried not to panic, but I was freaking out. I took a random turn down a side street, hoping he would lose interest, but when I checked the mirror again, he was still there, a few cars back, keeping pace with me. I took another turn, then another, winding through side streets, trying to shake him off, but every time I looked, he was still there. Finally, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, parked near the entrance, and practically ran inside. I didn't stop moving until I was deep in the store, hiding between the shelves of cereal boxes, trying to catch my breath. I stayed there for what felt like forever, too scared to go back outside. After about 20 minutes, I worked up the courage to check the parking lot through the store's front windows. The man's car was gone. I waited another 5 minutes, just to be sure, before heading back to my car. I took the longest, most roundabout way home, constantly checking my mirrors, but I didn't see him again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside my window had me on edge, and I kept thinking about that man, wondering if he'd found out where I lived. I even considered calling the police, but what would I say? That some guy followed me around a park and a few streets? It wasn't exactly a crime, but the fear I felt was real. I knew I'd been lucky to get away. I haven't been back to that park since. In fact, I avoid that whole side of town now. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to mess with me, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I trusted my gut that day, and I'm pretty sure it saved me from something bad. Sometimes you get that feeling for a reason. I've never been one to believe in wild conspiracy theories, but after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. It's not like I went looking for answers. Honestly, I wish I hadn't found any. But there's one theory that still sticks with me, one that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. The simulation theory. You probably heard about it. This idea that we're all living in a computer simulation, like some kind of hyper-advanced video game. At first, I thought it was a joke, something nerds talk about after too many hours spent watching The Matrix. But then something happened a few years ago that made me question everything. It all started with a glitch. At least, that's what it felt like. I was driving to work, stuck in my usual morning traffic. Nothing unusual. Same route, same cars, same boring routine. But as I was sitting there, waiting for the light to change, I noticed something odd. A man walking on the sidewalk up ahead. He was wearing a red jacket, a black hat, and carrying a briefcase. I didn't think anything of it at first, until I saw him again. Just a few blocks down. The exact same man. Red jacket, black hat, briefcase. Walking the exact same way. I remember thinking it was strange, but maybe it was just a coincidence. You know, two guys with the same taste in clothes. Weird, but not impossible. I let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days later, it happened again. I was in a different part of town, walking to grab some lunch, and I saw the same guy. Same red jacket, same black hat, same briefcase. This time, I stopped and watched him walk by. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to. As he passed, I looked around, half expecting to see him pop up again down the street. But he didn't. Still, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was wrong. That night, I started looking into things, just out of curiosity at first. I typed seeing the same person twice into Google, thinking maybe there was some rational explanation. Instead, I stumbled across a forum full of people talking about something called NPCs. You know, like in video games, non-player characters. Background people. The ones that just walk around aimlessly, repeating the same motions. Some of the posts were jokes, but others were unsettlingly serious. People were talking about how they kept seeing the same person or group of people in different places, doing the exact same thing over and over again. I didn't think much of it at first. The whole simulation idea seemed too far-fetched. But then it happened again and again. The same man, always in a red jacket, black hat, and briefcase, would show up in the most random places. I saw him while grocery shopping, sitting on a park bench, walking out of a cafe. No matter where I went, there he was, always the same clothes, always the same expressionless face. I even tried following him once. I know it sounds insane, but I was so curious I couldn't help myself. I followed him for about half a block before he turned a corner. When I rounded the corner, he was gone, just vanished. There was no alleyway, no door he could have slipped into. He was just gone. By now, I was freaked out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. I tried to talk myself out of it, telling myself I was just imagining things, that my brain was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the pieces didn't add up. I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing his face. Blank, emotionless, like he wasn't really there. Like he wasn't real. It was starting to drive me crazy. That's when I stumbled across a post about the simulation theory. At first, it sounded ridiculous. The idea that our entire existence is nothing more than a complex simulation, like some kind of cosmic video game. It seemed impossible. But the more I read, the more it started to make sense. People were talking about glitches, like seeing the same person over and over again in different places. Some talked about objects disappearing or reappearing out of nowhere. Others mentioned strange patterns, like how they always seemed to look at the clock at the same exact time, every day. It was eerie how similar their experiences were to mine. But the part that really got me was this one theory that NPCs, people like the man I kept seeing, are part of the simulation. They're not real people. They're just background characters, placed there to fill the world, but without any real purpose or life of their own. And when they glitch, it's a sign that the simulation is malfunctioning. I didn't want to believe it. I really didn't. But the more I tried to shake it off, the more things started to fall apart around me. I started seeing more people like him. Same clothes, same expressions, same movements. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they just repeat the same actions over and over. I even started noticing weird glitches in the world itself. Little things like the sky flickering for a split second or objects changing color when I looked away. It was subtle, but once I started paying attention, I couldn't unsee it. I haven't told anyone about this, because who would believe me? They'd think I was losing my mind. Hell, sometimes I think I'm losing my mind, but I can't deny what I've seen. The world doesn't feel real anymore. It feels like I'm living in some kind of elaborate simulation where things glitch out when no one's paying attention. And I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever is running this simulation knows I've noticed. Now, every time I leave the house, I can't help but scan the crowd, looking for him. The man in the red jacket, black hat, and briefcase. I haven't seen him in a while, but the damage is done. I'll never look at the world the same way again. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one noticing these glitches, or if other people see them too and just don't say anything. Maybe we're all living in this simulation together, pretending everything is normal, when deep down, we all know something's wrong. And maybe one day, the simulation will glitch so badly that none of us will be able to ignore it anymore. 10 years ago, but I can still remember every detail of that night. Some things just burn into your memory, you know? This wasn't one of those big, dramatic near-death moments or anything like that, but it was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and I'll never forget how it made me feel. At the time, I was living in this old apartment building downtown. It wasn't anything fancy. Actually, it was kind of a dump, but the rent was cheap, and I was fresh out of college, trying to save up a bit before moving somewhere better. The building was one of those old, creaky places with narrow hallways and dim lighting that always flickered like you were in some low-budget horror movie. But it was close to work, and it was mine, so I made it work. I lived on the 3rd floor, and my only real neighbor was this old guy named Mr. Harris, who lived across the hall. He was the kind of guy who always kept to himself. Never really talked much except to nod or grunt when I'd say hello. Sometimes I'd hear him coughing through the walls, and once in a while, I'd catch the smell of whatever he was cooking. But other than that, he was pretty much a ghost. Anyway, it was the middle of winter, and we just had one of those brutal snowstorms that shut everything down for a few days. I've been stuck inside the whole weekend, binge-watching whatever Netflix would offer, and eating way too much junk food. By Sunday night, I was going a little stir-crazy, so I decided to take out the trash just to get out of my apartment for a few minutes. The trash chute was at the end of the hallway, right by Mr. Harris's door. I grabbed my garbage bag and stepped out into the hallway. The whole floor was dark, except for one of those flickering lights I mentioned earlier. It was so quiet you could hear the old pipes groaning in the walls. As I walked toward the trash chute, I noticed something weird. Mr. Harris's door was slightly open. Just a crack, but enough that I could tell it wasn't shut all the way. Now, normally I wouldn't have thought much of it. Maybe he'd just forgotten to close it, or maybe he was airing out his apartment. But something about it felt wrong. I don't know why, but I just got this gut feeling that something wasn't right. I stood there for a second, staring at the door, waiting to hear movement or the sound of his TV or anything, really, but there was nothing. Just silence. That's when I made the dumb decision to knock. I should have just left it alone. I should have just dumped my trash and gone back to my apartment. But curiosity got the better of me. So I knocked lightly on the door, calling out, "Mr. Harris? You okay in there?" No response. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again, a little louder this time. "Mr. Harris?" Still nothing. By this point, I was feeling pretty uneasy. The door being open, the silence, it all felt wrong. I debated just walking away, but then I thought, what if something happened to him? I mean, the guy was old. What if he'd fallen or had a heart attack or something? I'd feel like an asshole if I just left him there, right? So, against my better judgment, I pushed the door open a little more and peeked inside. The apartment was dark, except for a faint light coming from the kitchen at the back. The living room was a mess. Newspapers piled up on the coffee table, a stack of dirty dishes on the floor next to an old recliner, and an ancient-looking TV that was turned off. It smelled musty, like old books and stale air, and there was this heavy feeling in the room, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. "Mr. Harris?" I called out, my voice shaky. Still nothing. I took a step inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen light flickered a little, casting these weird shadows across the walls. I called out his name one more time, louder now, but there was still no answer. That's when I noticed the bedroom door was slightly ajar. A sliver of light was spilling out into the hallway, and I could hear this faint, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but not quite. I know I should have left. I should have turned around and gone back to my apartment. But something pulled me forward, like I needed to know what was behind that door. My whole body was screaming at me to stop, but my legs kept moving. I reached the bedroom door and slowly pushed it open. The first thing I saw was Mr. Harris lying on the bed, completely still, his eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling. For a split second, I thought he was dead. My heart jumped into my throat, and I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet. But then he blinked. "Mr. Harris?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He didn't even move, just kept staring up at the ceiling like I wasn't even there. I took a step closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. But as soon as my fingers brushed his arm, his head snapped toward me. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and bloodshot, and his mouth opened just a little, like he was trying to say something. But no sound came out. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air in the room had been sucked out, and all I could do was stare back at him. And then I noticed something else. There was something standing in the corner of the room, a dark figure, barely visible in the dim light, but I could feel it there, watching us. It was tall, impossibly tall, with these long, thin limbs that stretched almost to the ceiling. Its face? I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was looking at me. Suddenly, Mr. Harris's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was ice cold, and his fingers dug into my skin with a strength I didn't think he could have. His eyes were wild, desperate, and he mouthed one word over and over. "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I ripped my arm away and bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my own place, locking the door and pushing a chair up against it like that would somehow keep me safe. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, listening to the deafening silence of the hallway outside. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't sleep for a lot of nights after that. Every creak, every sound, every flicker of light made me jump. I never saw Mr. Harris again after that. His apartment was empty the next morning. No sign of him or anyone else. I asked the building manager what happened to him, but he just shrugged and said the guy moved out in the middle of the night. I don't know what I saw in that room. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the lights flicker, I think about that figure standing in the corner. And I wonder if it's still watching. My first day in the industry was like a fever dream. The kind where you wake up the next day wondering if it all actually happened or if you imagine the whole thing. Spoiler alert, it definitely happened. And it was a mess. I was 20, working at a local diner, living paycheck to paycheck, and constantly stressing about money. Rent, car payments, student loans. I was drowning, and my shifts at the diner were barely enough to cover my basic expenses. Every month, it felt like I was one unexpected bill away from living out of my car. One night, I was venting to a friend over drinks, and she just casually said, "Why don't you try dancing?" At first, I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. She had done it before just for a couple of months and made decent money without getting too sucked into the scene. I laughed it off at the time, but that seed got planted in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about it over the next few days. Like, maybe it wasn't such a crazy idea after all. I mean, I already felt like I was doing a performance at the diner, faking smiles, pretending I was okay while I hustled for tips. So how different could it really be? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I figured, why not give it a shot? Worst case scenario, it's not for me and I bail. Best case scenario, I make some real money and dig myself out of this financial hole. So, after a week of overthinking, I finally Googled strip clubs in my area. I found one that didn't look too sketchy and had pretty decent reviews, for a strip club. I called ahead, and the manager told me to come by the next day for an audition. Audition. The word made me feel like I was trying out for a Broadway show, not, taking my clothes off for strangers. Anyway, I showed up that next afternoon, nervous as hell. The place looked more like a dive bar than a gentleman's club, but at least it wasn't some back alley, hole-in-the-wall kind of place. The manager, this older guy named Rick, greeted me when I walked in. He had the vibe of a grumpy but well-meaning uncle who's been in the business way too long. "First time?" he asked, and when I nodded, he gave me a once-over and said, "You'll be fine. Just don't overthink it." Easier said than done. Rick showed me around the place, gave me the lowdown on the house fees and tipping structure, then told me to get ready for my audition. I wasn't exactly sure what get ready meant, but luckily I had brought a change of clothes. A black lingerie set I had impulsively bought the day before. I didn't even feel sexy in it. Mostly, I just felt like I was playing dress up in a costume that didn't quite fit. There was no one in the club at that time, except for a couple of bartenders and a girl sweeping the stage. Rick told me to hop up there and do a quick routine to see if I could move. I had never danced on a stage in my life. I mean, I'd been to a few college parties and danced like everyone else, half drunk, half joking, but this was a whole other level of vulnerability. The music started, and I froze. I just stood there, gripping the pole like it was the only thing keeping me from fainting. My mind went blank. Do I spin? Do I crawl? Do I just stand here? Rick was watching me from the bar, and I knew I had to do something, so I just started moving. It wasn't graceful, and it definitely wasn't sexy. I kind of swayed back and forth, threw in a few awkward spins, and tried not to trip over my own feet. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 2 minutes before the music cut off. Rick chuckled and said, "You'll get the hang of it. Come back tonight if you're serious about this." I wasn't sure if I was serious, but I told him I'd be back anyway. So, that night, I showed up in what I thought was an appropriate outfit, tight, low-cut dress, platform heels, the whole deal. The other girls took one look at me and clearly knew I was new. They weren't rude, exactly, but they had that, "oh, another newbie" look in their eyes. I went back to the dressing room to try to calm down and met a girl named Angel who was doing her makeup in the mirror. She looked like a total pro, flawless makeup, perfect hair, and the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years. She asked me if it was my first night, and when I told her yes, she gave me this sympathetic smile and said, "Just don't fall in your heels, and you'll be fine." I wish I could say that was the worst thing that happened that night, but no, it got worse. My first stage set was a blur. The place wasn't packed, but there were enough guys there to make me feel completely out of my element. I did a few awkward spins around the pole, trying to copy what I'd seen other dancers do, but it was clear I had no idea what I was doing. A couple of guys tossed some singles on the stage, but mostly they just looked bored. I wasn't exactly raking in the cash. After my set, I tried my hand at lap dances. That's when things took a turn. My very first customer was this older guy who smelled like cigarettes and cheap cologne. He sat down in one of the private booths and handed me $40 for a couple of songs. I was nervous, but I figured, how hard could it be? I started dancing for him, trying to look confident even though I felt like a total fraud. About halfway through the second song, his hands started wandering, and I had no idea how to handle it. I'd been told that customers weren't supposed to touch unless invited, but clearly this guy didn't get the memo. I moved his hands away a couple of times, but he just kept putting them back. It wasn't aggressive, but it was persistent, and it threw me off. My mind was racing. Should I call someone over? Should I stop the dance? Should I just push through and finish? I ended up awkwardly pulling away and telling him the dance was over, even though there was still half a song left. He looked annoyed, but he didn't argue. He just stood up, grabbed his jacket, and left without another word. I sat in the booth for a few minutes after he left, trying to calm down. My heart was racing, and I felt like I'd done something wrong. But Angel found me a little while later and told me not to worry about it. "Happens all the time," she said. "You just have to learn how to handle those guys. Don't let them get to you." By the end of the night, I had made maybe $120, which was more than I expected for my first time, but still felt like a pretty low haul compared to what the other girls were raking in. As I walked home that night, my feet aching from the heels, I was exhausted, but also weirdly proud of myself. I had survived my first night. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't easy, but I'd made it through without completely falling apart. I went back the next weekend, and the weekend after that. Over time, I got better at it. I learned how to move, how to flirt without feeling like I was faking it, and most importantly, how to set boundaries with customers. It wasn't always fun, and there were definitely nights when I questioned what the hell I was doing with my life. But there were also nights when I walked out of the club with a fat stack of cash and felt like I could take on the world. I ended up dancing for about a year before I moved on to something else. It wasn't glamorous, but it got me through a tough time financially, and I don't regret it. If anything, it taught me how to handle myself in a way I never would have learned otherwise. So, yeah, my first day? Total disaster. But it got better, and I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. It all started so slowly that I didn't even realize what was happening until I was right in the middle of it. My partner and I had been together for nearly 5 years, and everything seemed pretty steady. You know, the usual ups and downs of a long-term relationship, but we were in a good place. Or at least, that's what I thought. We had just moved into a new apartment together, started talking about maybe getting a dog, and I genuinely believed we were on the same page about where our lives were heading. The first sign? It was the phone. Isn't it always the phone? He used to be so chill with his phone lying around the apartment, leaving it on the kitchen counter, the coffee table, wherever. He never cared if I saw his screen or even used it to play a song or check something online. Then one day, I noticed he started taking it with him everywhere, like everywhere. He'd go to the bathroom and bring it along, or he'd get up to grab something from the kitchen and take his phone with him like it was glued to his hand. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured he was just being more cautious because, well, everyone's more privacy conscious these days. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But then it became obvious. The phone was always on silent, and he'd flip it face down every time he put it down. And when I'd ask casually, "Who's texting?" he'd give me the vaguest answers like, "Oh, just work stuff," or "It's not important." The weird thing was his work wasn't the kind of job that blew up his phone after hours, but I didn't want to be the nagging girlfriend, so I let it go. Or at least I tried to. A few weeks later, the late night started. He'd always been home by 6, maybe 7 at the latest, and we'd make dinner together or binge-watch Netflix. But all of a sudden, he started staying late at work. At first, it was once or twice a week, which didn't raise too many red flags. I mean, people get busy, right? Then it became every other night. When I asked him about it, he gave me this long-winded explanation about a new project they were working on, how it was super intense and demanding. It sounded plausible enough, but something felt off. One night, I decided to surprise him at the office. I figured I'd swing by with some takeout, be the cool girlfriend who brings dinner when he's working late. I pulled up to his office around 8 p.m., only to find the parking lot nearly empty. His car wasn't there, and the building was dark. My heart sank. I called him, and when he answered, he said, "I'm just wrapping up here, should be home in about an hour." I asked, "Where are you?" "I'm outside the office, and it looks pretty dead." He paused for a second too long, and then said, "Oh, I stepped out to grab some coffee." It didn't make sense. I didn't want to accuse him of anything right there on the phone, so I played it cool, said I'd see him at home, and hung up. But inside, I was a mess. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't have any proof, and the thought of confronting him without knowing for sure terrified me. Then there was the change in his appearance. He'd always been the kind of guy who threw on whatever was clean and called it a day. But suddenly he was dressing better. New clothes, nicer shoes, and he started using cologne. A lot of cologne. I'm talking about the kind of cologne that makes you think he's going to some fancy dinner, not just heading to the office. When I teased him about it, like, "Wow, who are you trying to impress?" he just laughed it off and said he was trying to level up. It sounded harmless, but it didn't sit right with me. The sex changed too. Or, I should say, it mostly stopped. We used to have a pretty healthy sex life. But now, he barely touched me. Every time I try to initiate something, he'd give some excuse. He was tired, stressed, had a headache. You name it, he had it. It got to the point where I stopped even trying. I didn't want to be rejected anymore. One night, he came home really late, like 2 a.m. late, and he reeked of alcohol and perfume. I didn't say anything right away, but I couldn't keep quiet for long. The next morning, I asked him where he'd been. He told me he went out with some co-workers, that they had a few too many drinks, and one of the women in the office must have hugged him goodbye, which explained the perfume. It sounded so rehearsed, like he'd practiced that answer in his head before walking through the door. That's when I knew. I didn't have solid evidence, but every part of me was screaming that something was wrong. I started paying more attention, picking up on the little things. The way he'd quickly close out of apps on his phone when I walked into the room, the sudden new passwords on his devices, the late-night texts that he said were just work. I felt like I was going crazy, second-guessing myself constantly. Was I imagining it? Was I overreacting? I started to doubt my own instincts. It wasn't until I found a hotel receipt crumpled in his jacket pocket that I couldn't deny it anymore. It wasn't from any place nearby either. It was from a hotel 2 hours away, dated for a weekend when he told me he had to go on a work retreat. I hadn't thought much of it at the time because he'd been on those before, but seeing that receipt made my stomach drop. I sat there, staring at it for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went through his phone. While he was in the shower, I unlocked it. He'd made the mistake of using a password I'd seen him type in before, and found exactly what I'd been dreading. Texts, pictures, plans. There was another woman. They'd been seeing each other for months. There were messages about meeting up, staying the night at hotels, even inside jokes I didn't understand. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. When I finally confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. He just stood there, looking at me like he didn't know what to say. I was so angry, but more than that, I was hurt. I asked him how long it had been going on, and he admitted that it had started nearly a year ago. A whole year of lies. He said he didn't want to hurt me, that he'd felt trapped in our relationship and didn't know how to end it without breaking my heart. But that's exactly what he did. We broke up that night. There was no going back from something like that. I packed a bag and left. I couldn't bear to be in the same space as him, to look at the life we'd built together knowing that it had all been a lie. Looking back, the signs were all there. The secrecy, the defensiveness, the sudden changes in behavior. It was all right in front of me. I just didn't want to see it. It's crazy how your gut can scream at you, but your heart makes you ignore it because you don't want to believe the person you love could do that to you. If I've learned anything, it's to trust those instincts. People don't change overnight for no reason. If someone starts hiding things, keeping you at a distance, making you feel like you're overreacting for asking simple questions, something's up. I ignored the signs for too long, and in the end, it hurt me more than it ever should have. An injury for almost 3 years. Not a little sprain or something minor. No, I've been pretending I have chronic back pain, and it's completely changed my life. What's worse is that it all started with a stupid, offhand excuse to get out of something I didn't want to do, and now I can't undo it without blowing up everything. It started when I was working this grueling warehouse job. The hours were long, the pay was terrible, and the work was just, well, it was soul-crushing. I've been doing it for about a year and was completely burned out. Every day felt like it was sucking a little more life out of me. Anyway, one afternoon my boss asked me to stay late and do some extra lifting because one of the forklifts was down. I remember looking around and seeing everyone else making excuses, so I panicked. I needed an excuse too, something that would get me out of it without looking lazy. So I told him my back had been acting up. I said I must have pulled something earlier in the shift, and that lifting more would make it worse. He looked concerned, asked if I was okay, and even suggested I sit down for a bit. I thought I was in the clear. One little lie, no big deal, right? Except the next day, I showed up to work, and he'd reassigned me to a less physically demanding task. It wasn't glamorous, mostly paperwork and a little light maintenance, but compared to hauling heavy crates and standing on my feet all day, it was paradise. Suddenly, I wasn't breaking my back, literally, for hours on end, and for the first time in months, I didn't dread going into work. But now I had a problem. I couldn't just magically heal after a day or two, or it would look suspicious. So, I kept the lie going. I started walking slower, stretching more, wincing whenever someone mentioned my back. I'd take longer breaks, occasionally rub my lower back, and drop little comments about how the pain wasn't going away. Everyone was sympathetic. My boss even suggested I see a doctor, but I brushed it off, saying I didn't have insurance that would cover it. It felt like I'd hacked the system. My workload was lighter. No one questioned me, and I even got out of some extra shifts because of my condition. But then things started spiraling. Other people in the warehouse caught wind of it, and soon enough, I had co-workers asking if I was okay, offering me tips for pain relief, and telling me their own horror stories about chronic pain. I'd nod along, pretending to relate, while secretly feeling like the world's biggest fraud. It wasn't long before HR got involved. They pulled me into a meeting, and my stomach dropped when I realized what it was about. They were concerned about my back injury and wanted to know if I needed accommodations or if they should file a claim for workers' comp. At that moment, I should have come clean. I should have told them it was all a misunderstanding, a small excuse that had gotten out of hand. But I didn't. I doubled down, told them that yes, my back had been a problem for a while, and I was trying to manage it without getting medical help because I couldn't afford it. So, they made accommodations. They switched me to a permanent light-duty position and reduced my hours. And as soon as they did, I knew I was stuck. I couldn't back out now. My lie had turned into something way bigger than I ever intended, and I was terrified of being caught. But I couldn't stop either, because if I suddenly started acting better, everyone would know something was up. Now, 3 years later, I'm still living this lie. My whole work routine revolves around it. I pretend to have bad days where the pain is worse than usual, and I take extra breaks. I move slowly when people are watching, but the moment I'm alone, I move normally again. I've become an expert at faking it. Sometimes I even catch myself limping out of habit. This happened about 5 years ago when I was living in a small apartment in the city. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom place on the second floor of a pretty old building. The kind of place that creaked when you walked too fast and had pipes that groaned like they were 100 years old. But for me, it was perfect. I like being on my own and having my space. I never really thought twice about safety because, it's the city. People are everywhere, right? Well, that night made me rethink everything. It was a Thursday, I remember, because I had just finished a long shift at work and I was completely wiped out. I worked at a restaurant at the time, so my feet were killing me and all I wanted to do was get home, take a shower, and crash. It was around 11 p.m. when I finally got home, tossed my bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the couch. Now, this part of the city wasn't exactly bad, but it wasn't the greatest either. It was one of those places that was fine during the day, but at night, you just didn't go walking around alone. But I'd been living there for a couple of years without any issues, so I'd gotten used to the routine. Come home late, lock the door, and zone out in front of the TV until I passed out. No big deal. That night, though, something was different. As I was sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, I started to get this weird feeling. It was subtle at first, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but I couldn't ignore it. It was like a low-level anxiety humming in the background, like I was waiting for something to happen. I got up, double-checked that the front door was locked, and went to the kitchen to grab some water. The kitchen window faced the alley behind the building, which was usually pretty quiet except for the occasional stray cat knocking over a garbage can. But when I looked out the window that night, I saw something, or rather, someone that made my stomach drop. There was a man standing in the alley, right under the dim streetlight. He wasn't moving, just standing there staring up at my window. At first, I thought maybe he was drunk or lost, but the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. He wasn't stumbling around or looking confused. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring. I backed away from the window and turned off the kitchen light, hoping that maybe if I couldn't see him, he wouldn't see me. I told myself it was probably nothing, just some random guy, and tried to brush it off. But that feeling, that gut-wrenching, something is very wrong feeling, kept gnawing at me. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I sat there for a while, listening to the sounds of the building creaking, the distant hum of traffic trying to calm down. But then, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps, not in the hallway, but right outside my window. My apartment had this tiny little balcony, just big enough for a couple of chairs, and I heard someone walking on it. Slowly, deliberately, like they were trying not to be heard. I froze, my mind racing. The balcony wasn't accessible from the street. It was on the second floor, meaning someone would have had to climb up to get there. I tiptoed over to the window, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I peeked through the blinds, just enough to see the edge of the balcony, and my blood went cold. The same man from the alley was now standing on my balcony. He was facing the window, staring directly at it, his face partially hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the fact that he had climbed up to my second-floor apartment to stand there, watching, made me feel like I was trapped in a nightmare. I backed away from the window, panic surging through me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I turn off all the lights and pretend I wasn't home? I grabbed my phone and started to dial 911, but before I could press the call button, I heard it. The doorknob. He was trying to open the sliding glass door that led to the balcony. The handle rattled softly at first, like he was testing it, and then there was a louder, more deliberate tug. The door was locked, thank God, but the fact that he was trying to get in sent me into full-blown panic mode. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy glass vase, and stood by the door, ready to swing if he managed to break through. My hands were shaking so badly, I thought I might drop it. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for him to try something else, but after a few more tugs on the door, everything went quiet. I didn't dare move. I just stood there clutching the vase, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed, but there was nothing. No more rattling, no footsteps, no sound at all. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out the window again, and to my absolute relief, the balcony was empty. I don't know if he gave up or if he realized I wasn't alone, even though I was, but he was gone. I immediately called the police, my hands still shaking, and told them what had happened. They showed up about 20 minutes later, but by then, the guy was long gone. They checked the alley and the building, but there was no sign of him. The police told me it was probably just a random creep, maybe someone who had seen me come home and decided to follow me. They said there had been reports of break-ins in the area recently, and it sounded like he was just trying to get into an easy target. But the fact that he climbed up to my balcony, that he knew exactly where to go, made me think this wasn't random at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been watching me for a while, waiting for the perfect opportunity. After that night, I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept imagining that man on the balcony, staring through the window. I moved out a month later, and I've never lived on a lower floor since. That gut feeling, the one that told me something wasn't right, I'll never ignore it again. Sometimes your instincts know before you do. Taking an injury for almost 3 years. Not a little sprain or something minor. No, I've been pretending I have chronic back pain, and it's completely changed my life. What's worse is that it all started with a stupid, offhand excuse to get out of something I didn't want to do, and now I can't undo it without blowing up everything. It started when I was working this grueling warehouse job. The hours were long, the pay was terrible, and the work was just, well, it was soul-crushing. I've been doing it for about a year and was completely burned out. Every day felt like it was sucking a little more life out of me. Anyway, one afternoon, my boss asked me to stay late and do some extra lifting because one of the forklifts was down. I remember looking around and seeing everyone else making excuses, so I panicked. I needed an excuse too, something that would get me out of it without looking lazy. So I told him my back had been acting up. I said I must have pulled something earlier in the shift, and that lifting more would make it worse. He looked concerned, asked if I was okay, and even suggested I sit down for a bit. I thought I was in the clear. One little lie, no big deal, right? Except the next day, I showed up to work, and he'd reassigned me to a less physically demanding task. It wasn't glamorous, mostly paperwork and a little light maintenance, but compared to hauling heavy crates and standing on my feet all day, it was paradise. Suddenly, I wasn't breaking my back, literally, for hours on end, and for the first time in months, I didn't dread going into work. But now I had a problem. I couldn't just magically heal after a day or two, or it would look suspicious. So, I kept the lie going. I started walking slower, stretching more, wincing whenever someone mentioned my back. I'd take longer breaks, occasionally rub my lower back, and drop little comments about how the pain wasn't going away. Everyone was sympathetic. My boss even suggested I see a doctor, but I brushed it off, saying I didn't have insurance that would cover it. It felt like I'd hacked the system. My workload was lighter, no one questioned me, and I even got out of some extra shifts because of my condition. But then things started spiraling. Other people in the warehouse caught wind of it, and soon enough, I had co-workers asking if I was okay, offering me tips for pain relief, and telling me their own horror stories about chronic pain. I'd nod along, pretending to relate, while secretly feeling like the world's biggest fraud. It wasn't long before HR got involved. They pulled me into a meeting, and my stomach dropped when I realized what it was about. They were concerned about my back injury and wanted to know if I needed accommodations or if they should file a claim for workers' comp. At that moment, I should have come clean. I should have told them it was all a misunderstanding, a small excuse that had gotten out of hand. But I didn't. I doubled down, told them that yes, my back had been a problem for a while, and I was trying to manage it without getting medical help because I couldn't afford it. So, they made accommodations. They switched me to a permanent light-duty position and reduced my hours. And as soon as they did, I knew I was stuck. I couldn't back out now. My lie had turned into something way bigger than I ever intended, and I was terrified of being caught. But I couldn't stop either, because if I suddenly started acting better, everyone would know something was up. Now, 3 years later, I'm still living this lie. My whole work routine revolves around it. I pretend to have bad days where the pain is worse than usual, and I take extra breaks. I move slowly when people are watching, but the moment I'm alone, I move normally again. I've become an expert at faking it. Sometimes I even catch myself limping out of habit, even when no one's around. It's ridiculous. But here's the thing, it's affected my life outside of work too. I had to tell my family about the injury because they started noticing I wasn't doing physical stuff like I used to. I stopped playing basketball with my buddies, avoided helping people move, and skipped out on activities I actually enjoyed because I didn't want anyone to think I was faking. I've built this whole life around a fake injury, and now I'm constantly worried someone's going to call me out on it. The worst part is that I've started to believe it myself. There are days where I catch myself wincing or rubbing my back when no one's looking, even though there's nothing wrong with me. It's like my body has internalized the lie, and I've convinced myself that I should be in pain, even though I'm not. I know I need to come clean. I've thought about it a million times, but the longer I wait, the worse it gets. If I tell the truth now, I'll lose my job for sure. Maybe even face legal trouble for lying to HR and getting special accommodations I didn't need. My coworkers would hate me. My family would be furious. I'd probably lose a lot of people in my life over this. But every day, I feel the guilt weighing on me. I've been walking around for years with this invisible burden, pretending to be someone I'm not. And for what? A slightly easier job? A few more breaks? The price I've paid in anxiety, stress, and fear of being found out isn't worth it. I've considered just quitting my job and moving to another city to start fresh. Maybe that's the only way out. Leave everything behind, pretend none of this ever happened, and hope that I don't carry this habit with me. But I know that's just running from my problems, and eventually, I'd have to face the truth. I don't know what the breaking point will be, but I feel it coming. I can't keep this up forever. One day, the lie will catch up to me, and I'll have to deal with the consequences. But until then, I'll keep pretending that my back hurts, pretending that I'm not living a lie, pretending that everything's fine. So, this story takes place during my junior year, and to this day, I can't believe we didn't end up expelled, or worse. I went to a small high school, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and if something big happened, it didn't stay a secret for long. The whole school would know within hours, especially if it was something wild. This was one of those times. We had this teacher, Mr. Hastings, who taught chemistry. Now, Mr. Hastings wasn't your typical boring chem teacher. He was young, maybe late 20s, and he actually made chemistry kind of fun. He'd do all these cool experiments, like setting things on fire or making stuff explode in the lab. But the thing that really made Mr. Hastings stand out was that he was way too laid back. He treated us more like we were his friends than his students, and honestly, sometimes it felt like he forgot we were a bunch of teenagers. Anyway, one day a couple of guys in my class, let's call them Tim and Alex, decided they wanted to see if they could pull off the ultimate chemistry prank. The kind of prank that would make them legends. They'd been talking about it for weeks, and the plan was simple. Steal some chemicals from the lab, mix them together, and see what happened. You know, classic dumb high school logic. What could go wrong, right? So, it's a regular Tuesday afternoon, and we're all sitting in chemistry class. Mr. Hastings had left the room for a minute to go grab something from the supply closet, and that's when Tim and Alex decided it was time to make their move. I was sitting near the back, minding my own business, when I noticed them whispering and glancing around the room like they were planning a heist. I had no idea what they were up to, but knowing those two, it couldn't be good. Sure enough, as soon as Mr. Hastings stepped out, Tim bolted to the storage cabinet where all the chemicals were kept. Now, normally that cabinet was locked, but for some reason, Hastings had forgotten to lock it that day. It was like the stars had aligned for Tim and Alex's stupid plan. Tim grabbed a couple of bottles, no idea what they were, but they looked official, and sprinted back to his seat. Alex started mixing them together on a lab table like he knew what he was doing, but I'm pretty sure he had no clue. At first, nothing happened. They were both just standing there, staring at the beaker like they expected it to burst into flames or something. A couple of us were watching, curious, but also kind of terrified about what might go down. Then all of a sudden, the liquid in the beaker started to bubble. And not in a normal, oh, we're doing science kind of way. This was violent bubbling, like it was about to explode. Tim and Alex looked at each other with wide eyes, and I could tell they were starting to realize they might have made a huge mistake. Alex whispered, "Dude, I think we should stop," but it was already too late. The beaker started to overflow, and this thick, greenish smoke started pouring out. At first, it just looked weird, but then the smell hit us. Let me tell you, this wasn't your average bad smell. It was horrible, like rotten eggs mixed with something burning. People started gagging, and the entire classroom went into panic mode. Some kids were covering their noses. Others were running for the door, and I swear one girl started crying because she thought we were all about to die from toxic fumes. By this point, the whole lab was filled with smoke, and you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. The fire alarm started blaring, and that's when Mr. Hastings came running back into the room, looking like he'd just walked into a war zone. He saw the smoke, the beaker, and then Tim and Alex standing there with their hands up like they were about to surrender to the cops. Mr. Hastings lost it. I'd never seen him angry before, but man, he was furious. He started yelling at Tim and Alex, something about how they were lucky they didn't blow the whole school up. Meanwhile, the rest of us were still trying to figure out if we were going to die from whatever toxic mess they created. The next thing we knew, the fire department showed up. Yeah, it got that bad. They evacuated the entire school, and we all had to stand outside while a bunch of firefighters in hazmat suits went into the building. There were rumors flying around that we'd all been exposed to some deadly chemical and would have to be quarantined. One kid swore we'd be on the news that night, and for a brief moment, I actually thought we were going to be in some kind of government containment unit like in the movies. Turns out, the chemicals Tim and Alex mixed together weren't lethal, but they did create some kind of reaction that produced sulfur dioxide gas, which explained the awful smell and the choking. The firefighters managed to vent the room, and after a couple of hours, they let us back inside. But the lab? Completely trashed. There were burn marks on the counter, the beaker had cracked, and everything smelled like rotten eggs for days. Now, here's the crazy part. You'd think Tim and Alex would have been expelled for something like that, right? No. Mr. Hastings actually covered for them. I guess he didn't want the school to know he'd left the chemical cabinet unlocked. So he told the principal that it was just an accident during a lab experiment gone wrong. Tim and Alex got a slap on the wrist, detention for a couple of weeks, and that was it. They were basically heroes after that. Everyone knew they'd pulled off the craziest prank of the year, and even though it was stupid and dangerous, they got away with it. The story spread around school like wildfire, and for weeks after, people would come up to Tim and Alex asking them about the explosion. They made it sound way cooler than it actually was, of course. According to them, they almost blew up the entire science wing, which was definitely not true, but hey, it made for a good story. Mr. Hastings, though, he was different after that. He was still laid back, but he never left us alone in the lab again. And he always locked the chemical cabinet after that day. So yeah, that's the story of how two idiots nearly gassed the whole class with sulfur dioxide and somehow became legends for it. Definitely not something I'll forget anytime soon. I never thought I'd be one of those people who believes in conspiracies, but sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. This one still gives me chills whenever I think about it. It's the theory that the Mandela effect isn't just some quirk of human memory, but actual evidence of parallel universes overlapping. And I'm convinced it's real, because I've lived through it. It all started with something small. You know how people talk about remembering things differently, like that famous one about the Berenstain Bears? Some people swear it was spelled Berenstein with an E when they were kids, but now it's spelled Berenstain with an A. I didn't think much of it at first. Just thought, okay, people's memories are faulty, it happens. But then I noticed something in my own life that I couldn't explain away so easily. A few years ago, I was going through some old boxes in my parents' attic. We were cleaning out their house to move them into a smaller place, and I came across some childhood stuff, old toys, school projects, that sort of thing. And there it was, an old VHS tape of the Berenstain Bears. With an E. I'm not kidding. I stared at that tape for what felt like hours, flipping it over and over in my hands. I even checked the back to see if it was some kind of off-brand knockoff, but no, it was legit. Same logo, same characters, everything. But it was spelled Berenstein. I thought maybe it was just an old printing, maybe they changed the spelling later on and I just never noticed. But that's when things started to get weird. A few weeks later, I was telling a friend about my weird discovery when she brought up something she'd experienced. She said she vividly remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the late 80s. She even remembered watching the news coverage with her parents as a kid. The thing is, Mandela didn't die in prison. He was released in 1990 and lived until 2013. But my friend was adamant. She swore she remembered seeing the funeral, hearing world leaders talk about his legacy. She was so certain that it made me question my own memories. I didn't remember Mandela dying in the 80s, but her conviction shook me. After that, I started noticing more and more of these little inconsistencies, small details that didn't quite line up with how I remembered things. The spelling of words, the names of famous products, even lyrics to songs I knew by heart seemed off. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I came across a forum online where people were discussing something called the Mandela effect. I started reading post after post of people sharing their experiences, how they remembered things differently, how they'd found physical evidence that contradicted the official version of reality, just like my Berenstein Bears tape. And then I stumbled onto the parallel universe theory. According to this theory, the Mandela effect happens because we're experiencing bleed-through from parallel universes. In some of these universes, things played out differently. Maybe in one universe, it really was the Berenstein Bears, or Nelson Mandela did die in the 80s. But for some reason, our realities are overlapping, and we're getting glimpses of these alternate timelines. The idea is that the universe isn't just one linear reality. It's a multiverse with infinite versions of ourselves, each living slightly different lives. And every now and then, those universes collide, leaving behind these small, strange anomalies that don't quite make sense. I was skeptical at first. Parallel universes? Really? It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. But the more I read, the more it started to make sense. How else could so many people from all over the world have the same exact false memories? There had to be more to it than just faulty recollection. What really convinced me was when it happened again, this time with something much more personal. My grandmother passed away when I was young, and I always remembered her funeral being on a Wednesday. It was one of those clear memories that sticks with you forever. What I wore, who was there, the rain that poured down all day. But when I went through some family photos recently, I found a newspaper clipping about her death. According to the paper, her funeral was on a Monday, not Wednesday. I couldn't believe it. I even asked my mom, and she confirmed it Monday. But I knew, deep down, that wasn't right. I remember it being Wednesday. I remember missing school for it. I remember my teachers telling me how sorry they were the day I came back. And it was definitely midweek, not the start. I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, somewhere, things had shifted without me knowing. After that, I started paying closer attention to everything. I'd test myself on small details I thought I knew, only to find that more and more things didn't match up with my memories. It's like I'm living in a version of reality that isn't quite my own, but just close enough that most people don't notice. They go on with their lives, unaware that something has changed. But I can't unsee it. Now, whenever I see one of those small differences, whether it's the spelling of a word or the color of a product I've known for years, I can't help but wonder, did I just slip into a different timeline? Are there more of me out there in other universes remembering things differently? And if so, how many more glitches are there that we haven't even noticed? I don't have all the answers, and I don't know if we ever will. But I can't shake the feeling that the Mandela effect is more than just a trick of memory. Maybe it's proof that the world is far stranger than we ever imagined. And that terrifies me more than any conspiracy I've ever heard. I'll tell you about the time I almost died from showering. Yeah, you read that right. A good rinse nearly took me out. And no, I didn't slip on a bar of soap or anything ridiculous like that. The killer in this story? Hot water and bad timing. It was a regular weekday morning, and I was running late for work as usual. I'm not a morning person, so my routine is a mad dash from bed to bathroom, trying to squeeze every last second of sleep out of the night. I jump in the shower, Turn the water up nice and hot, because who doesn't love a steamy shower to wake you up and go through the motions, shampoo, rinse, repeat. I wasn't even thinking about anything, just zoning out in that warm, watery bliss. But here's where things went sideways. My apartment is one of those older buildings with really old plumbing. I noticed the water pressure could get weird sometimes, but it was never more than an annoyance. That day, though, I guess the stars aligned in the worst way possible. About halfway through, the water suddenly got scalding hot. Like it wasn't just a little warmer, this was melt your skin off hot. My immediate reaction was to jump out of the stream, which would have been smart if I hadn't completely lost my footing on the slippery shower floor. Next thing I know, I'm falling backward in the most ungraceful way imaginable. Now, when you're mid-fall, your brain works in slow motion. All I could think was, don't crack your head on the tiles. And for a split second, I thought I'd managed to save myself by twisting at the last minute. But instead of hitting my head on the wall, I smashed hard into the edge of the bathtub, right on my lower back. The pain was instant, like someone had swung a sledgehammer into my spine. At first, I couldn't breathe. I was lying there, naked and gasping for air like a fish out of water. The hot water was still blasting down, and now I had the added bonus of being half drenched and half scalded while my body freaked out about the pain. My back was on fire, and I couldn't move. I'm not exaggerating when I say I was convinced I was paralyzed. It took a good minute or two for me to catch my breath and assess the damage. I tried to sit up, but my back screamed in protest. My legs weren't working right. They felt tingly like they'd fallen asleep, but worse. Panic set in. I thought, this is it. This is how it happens. I break my back in the shower and die like some punchline in a bad joke. I'm lying there, half in and half out of the tub, scalding water still pouring over me, when I realized something terrifying. No one knew I was there. I lived alone. No roommates, no pets, no one. If I couldn't get up, there was nobody to come find me. The thought of just lying there for hours, maybe days, until someone realized I wasn't at work and decided to check on me. It freaked me out enough to force myself to move. I managed to roll over onto my stomach, and I crawled, literally crawled, out of the bathroom, soaking wet in agony, barely able to move my legs. I grabbed my phone off the counter and called 911, trying to stay calm, even though I was shaking and sobbing by this point. The dispatcher kept asking if I was okay, but I honestly didn't know. I just kept saying, I think I broke my back. The ambulance arrived pretty quickly. Thank God, but let me tell you, nothing is more humiliating than having two paramedics find you lying naked on your floor, unable to stand. They were professional about it, of course, but I could tell they'd seen this kind of thing before. One of them even made a joke like, well, looks like you've had a rough morning. I didn't laugh, obviously. Long story short, I ended up in the hospital. They ran a bunch of tests, and thankfully, I didn't actually break my spine, though I did bruise the hell out of it and mess up some nerves. The doctor said I was lucky I hadn't hit my head when I fell, or I might not have been alive to tell the tale. I spent weeks recovering, hobbling around like an old man and popping painkillers just to get through the day. But the thing that stuck with me the most wasn't the pain. It was how fast everything happened. 1 second, I'm enjoying a shower, and the next, I'm on the verge of paralysis or death. It was that quick. A little too hot water, one wrong step, and boom, my entire life could have changed. Or ended. And here's the kicker. I'd always heard about people slipping in the shower and thought, that's not going to happen to me. I'm young. I'm careful. I'm fine. You know, slipping in the shower can kill you, plain and simple. We take it for granted because it's just part of our daily routine, but that's exactly why it's so dangerous. You're not thinking about the fact that one misstep could be your last. Now I'm that guy who's paranoid about shower safety. I've got one of those anti-slip mats, and I turn the water temperature down before I even step in. And I definitely double-check the water pressure every time just in case. The thought of ending up back on the floor like that? No thanks. So yeah, if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's this. Don't underestimate the dangers of your own bathroom. It sounds ridiculous, but slipping in the shower or falling the wrong way can end your life in seconds. You won't see it coming, and by the time you realize it, it could already be too late. Anyway, I guess the moral of the story is, be careful where you least expect it, and maybe, just maybe, take a second to appreciate that boring, everyday stuff that keeps you safe, because when things go wrong, you're going to wish you had.